The train lurched to a stop with a screech of metal that set Eliza's teeth on edge. She'd been holding the same position for 3 hours. Back straight, hands folded over the carpet bag in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The other passengers had given up trying to make conversation somewhere around the second day. She had that look about her, the kind that said she didn't want company, didn't need sympathy, and sure as hell wasn't interested in small talk about weather or politics or whatever else strangers used to fill empty air. Outside the window, Blackthorn Ridge materialized through coal smoke like something out of a half-remembered nightmare. It wasn't much. A muddy main street. Buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together by men who had better things to do. A few sorry excuses for storefronts. And beyond that, nothing but mountains and sky and the kind of emptiness that made a person feel very small and very alone. Eliza stood, smoothed her travel-stained dress, and stepped off the train into late autumn cold that cut straight through her coat. The platform was nearly empty. Just a station clerk who barely looked up from his ledger and 2 ranch hands loading supply crates onto a wagon. Neither of them paid her any attention. She might as well have been invisible. For a moment she considered getting back on the train, just turning around, finding a seat, and riding back to wherever the tracks led. It wouldn't be home. Home didn't exist anymore, but it would be away from here. Away from this godforsaken town that looked like it was barely hanging on to existence itself. But then she thought about the letter. The one folded in her coat pocket, creased and reread so many times the paper had gone soft. The one from Caleb Mercer, cattle rancher, widower, father of 6. The one that didn't promise love or comfort or anything resembling romance. Just survival. Just a chance at something that wasn't the charity of distant relatives who made it clear she'd overstayed her welcome. She picked up her bag and started walking. The town revealed itself in pieces as she moved down the main street. A general store with half-empty shelves visible through dirty windows. A saloon that looked like it had seen better days about 20 years ago. A church with a crooked steeple. And people. Not many, but enough to notice her. A woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the dry goods store stopped mid-stroke and stared. 2 men loading lumber onto a cart glanced over, then went back to work. But she caught the smirk on one of their faces. An older woman in a faded bonnet actually turned away, like looking at Eliza might somehow contaminate her. Eliza kept walking. The Mercer Ranch was 3 miles outside town, according to the letter. She'd planned to ask someone for directions, maybe hire a wagon if one was available. But the longer she stood on that street feeling eyes on her back, the less she wanted to ask these people for anything. "You the mail-order bride?" The voice came from behind her, flat and unimpressed. Eliza turned. The woman was maybe 40, maybe 60. Hard to tell with frontier women who'd spent too many years squinting into sun and wind. She wore a practical work dress and an expression that suggested she'd already made up her mind about Eliza and found her lacking. "I'm Eliza Vance," Eliza said. "I'm expected at the Mercer Ranch." "That what they're calling it these days?" The woman looked her up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock. "Expected." "Well, Caleb's wagon should be along shortly. He knows when the train comes." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." The woman shifted the basket she was carrying to her other hip. "You look like a strong wind could carry you off. Ranch life ain't easy for women built for parlor sitting." Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest. Not anger exactly. More like recognition. She'd heard variations of this speech before, from her late husband's family, from the townspeople back east who'd watched her bury a husband and lose a home in the same year, from everyone who seemed to think they could measure a person's worth by looking at them. "I'll manage," she said. "Sure you will." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just like the last one managed." Then she walked away, leaving Eliza standing alone on the boardwalk with her carpet bag and a sick feeling in her stomach. The last one. The letter hadn't mentioned a last one. She was still standing there, trying to decide whether to be angry or worried or just tired, when the wagon appeared. It came around the bend at the end of town, pulled by 2 horses that looked as worn out as everything else in this place. The man driving wasn't what she expected. Caleb Mercer was big. Not fat, not soft, but built like someone who'd spent his whole life doing hard physical labor. His face was weathered in a way that made him look older than he probably was, all sharp angles and sun damage, and the kind of permanent squint that came from years of staring into distances. He wore work clothes that had seen better days and a hat with a brim that shadowed his eyes. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her and climbed down with the slow, careful movements of a man who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary speed. "Mrs. Vance?" His voice matched his appearance, low, rough, like he didn't use it much for talking. "Mr. Mercer." They stood there for a moment, two strangers measuring each other in the middle of a dying frontier town. Eliza wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Probably the same thing everyone else saw. A thin, tired woman who didn't look strong enough for the life she'd signed up for. "This everything?" He gestured at her single bag. "Yes." He picked it up and loaded it into the wagon bed without comment. Then he held out a hand to help her up onto the seat. His grip was calloused and strong and completely impersonal. The ride out to the ranch was quiet. Not comfortable quiet. The kind of silence that pressed down like weight, filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Eliza kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape roll by. Endless grass turning brown with approaching winter, mountains in the distance wearing their first snow, sky so big it made her feel dizzy. "Kids are at the ranch," Caleb said finally. "All 6 of them. Mara's the oldest. She's 17. Then the boys, Thomas is 15, Ben's 13, Daniel's 11. And the little ones, Annie's 5, and Samuel just turned 3. Eliza nodded, committing the names to memory. "They know I'm coming?" "They know." "And?" Caleb's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "They'll adjust." Which wasn't an answer at all. The ranch appeared gradually. First just a break in the landscape, then structures taking shape. A main house, barn, various outbuildings. As they got closer, Eliza could see the damage. Fencing sagging in places, missing entirely in others. The barn listing slightly to one side. Weeds growing where they shouldn't. The whole place had the look of something slowly falling apart while everyone pretended not to notice. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house. It was bigger than Eliza expected, a 2-story structure that must have been impressive once. Now it just looked tired. Paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked, a porch that needed new boards. The front door opened before they could climb down from the wagon. 6 children spilled out onto the porch in a knot of curiosity and suspicion. Eliza picked them out quickly. Mara in front, tall and dark-haired and wearing an expression that could freeze water. The boys ranged behind her in descending order of size, all of them with their father's sharp features and guarded eyes. And the little ones, Annie and Samuel, peeking out from behind their older siblings' legs. "Kids," Caleb said, climbing down and offering Eliza his hand again. "This is Mrs. Vance. She'll be staying." Mara's expression didn't change. "Ma'am." The word was correct and cold and absolutely hostile. "Hello, Mara." Eliza met the girl's eyes and held them. "Thomas, Ben, Daniel, Annie, Samuel, it's good to meet you all." Silence. Annie tugged on Mara's skirt and whispered something. Mara bent down, listened, then straightened up again. "Annie wants to know if you're going to be our new mother." The question landed like a stone in still water. Eliza saw Caleb tense beside her, saw the way the boys shifted their weight, saw little Samuel's lower lip start to tremble. This was a test. Maybe not a fair one, but definitely a test. "No," Eliza said quietly. "I'm not going to be your new mother. You already had a mother and nobody can replace her. I'm just going to be here to help your father take care of things. That's all." Something flickered in Mara's expression. Not quite approval, but maybe a fraction less hostility. "We can take care of ourselves," the girl said. "I'm sure you can." Eliza picked up her carpet bag from the wagon bed. "But maybe you could show me where to put my things anyway. And then perhaps you could tell me where the kitchen is. It's been a long journey, and I expect everyone could use some supper." For a moment, Mara just stared at her. Then she turned on her heel and walked back into the house. Eliza followed. The interior matched the exterior. A house that had once been well kept but had slowly descended into functional chaos. Eliza's eyes cataloged everything automatically. Dust thick on surfaces. Dishes piled in the kitchen sink. Coats thrown over chairs instead of hung up. The smell of a house where too many people were living without enough time or energy to maintain it properly. Mara led her upstairs to a small room at the end of the hall. This was the sewing room, she said flatly. Pa moved a bed in here. You'll share the washroom with everyone else. Water's downstairs. We heat it on the stove. Thank you. Mara started to leave, then stopped in the doorway. The last woman only stayed 3 weeks. She cried every night. We could hear her through the walls. Then one morning she was just gone. Left a note saying she couldn't do it. Eliza set her bag down on the narrow bed. I'm not going to cry, Mara. Everyone cries eventually. Maybe. Eliza turned to face her. But not because this place is hard. Hard I can handle. I've handled worse. You don't look like you've handled worse. No, Eliza agreed. I probably don't. They stood there, 2 women sizing each other up across the small room. Mara was so young, but there was something ancient in her eyes. The look of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast, to shoulder burdens that should have been someone else's. Where's the kitchen? Eliza asked again. Mara's expression shifted slightly. Why? Because I told you I was going to make supper, and I don't intend to be a liar. For the first time, something that might have been curiosity crossed Mara's face. We usually just make whatever's easiest. Beans, cornbread if someone remembers to mix it. Sometimes the boys shoot something and we roast it. That sounds practical, Eliza said. But tonight I'd like to see what you have in the pantry and what condition the stove is in. If you'll show me where things are, I'd appreciate it. Mara shrugged. Suit yourself? The kitchen was worse than Eliza expected. Not filthy. Someone had made an effort at basic cleanliness. But disorganized to the point of dysfunctional. Supplies jumbled together with no system. Pots and pans stacked haphazardly. The stove crusted with months of cooking residue. An icebox that clearly hadn't been emptied or cleaned in too long. Eliza stood in the middle of it and felt the familiar sensation of a problem presenting itself for solving. Mara, she said, I'll need hot water, several pots full. And could you ask the boys to bring in firewood? Enough for tonight and tomorrow morning. We already brought in firewood. Then bring in more. Eliza was already rolling up her sleeves. This stove needs serious cleaning before I can use it properly, and that's going to take heat and time. We don't usually... I'm not asking you to do it like you usually do it, Eliza said, not unkindly. I'm asking you to do it the way I need it done, just for tonight. If you decide tomorrow that you don't want to help me, that's your choice. But tonight I need hot water and firewood. Mara stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, she turned and yelled down the hall. Thomas, Ben, Mrs. Vance needs firewood. Move. Eliza spent the next 4 hours transforming the kitchen. She scrubbed the stove until her hands ached, reorganized the pantry into something resembling a functional system, sorted through ingredients that had gone bad and tossed them, found a sourdough starter that had been shoved to the back of a shelf and was miraculously still alive, though barely. The children drifted in and out, watching. Thomas brought firewood 3 separate times, each load bigger than the last, like he was testing to see how much she actually needed. Ben appeared with fresh water without being asked. Daniel hung around the doorway, not quite brave enough to come in, but too curious to leave. Even little Annie ventured into the kitchen, dragging Samuel behind her, and stood by the table watching Eliza work with huge, solemn eyes. Only Mara kept her distance. She appeared once to deliver the hot water Eliza had requested, then disappeared again. Eliza could hear her moving around upstairs, the sound of someone deliberately staying busy to avoid having to engage. Fine. Let her have her space. This wasn't going to be solved in one night anyway. By the time Caleb came in from checking the evening livestock, the kitchen smelled like bread and bacon and something that might have been hope if hope could have a scent. He stopped in the doorway and stared. Didn't expect, he started, then trailed off. Bread's almost ready, Eliza said. I found some apples that were about to turn, so I fried those with a little sugar and cinnamon. Bacon gravy for the bread. Coffee's hot. It's not fancy, but it should fill everyone up. Caleb looked at the table she'd set. Nothing special, just plates and forks and cups arranged properly, but it was the first time in who knew how long that someone had set his table like a meal was something that mattered. You didn't have to. Yes, Eliza interrupted quietly. I did. He didn't argue. When the children came down for supper, they moved like people approaching something fragile that might break if they weren't careful. They took their seats slowly, watching Eliza as she put food on the table, watching their father to see how he'd react. Little Annie climbed into the chair next to Eliza without asking permission and announced, I'm sitting here. All right, Eliza said. This is where I sit for important meals, Annie continued seriously, like Christmas and birthdays. Then I'm honored. The meal was quiet at first, everyone too busy eating to talk, or maybe too shocked by the fact that food could actually taste good. Eliza had forgotten what it was like to cook for people who were truly hungry. Not just physically hungry, but hungry for the kind of care that went into a properly prepared meal. Halfway through, Thomas spoke up. This is real good, ma'am. Thank you, Thomas. Better than what we usually have, Ben added, earning a sharp look from Mara. Well, Eliza said carefully, I expect you've all been doing the best you can with what you had. Sometimes having an extra pair of hands makes things easier. Mama used to make bread like this, Annie announced. Remember, Mara, Mama's bread? The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Mara's fork clattered against her plate. Don't. But she did. She made... I said don't. Mara stood up abruptly. May I be excused? Caleb looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He just nodded. Mara left the table without looking at anyone. The rest of the meal continued in uncomfortable silence. The younger children finished quickly and escaped upstairs. The older boys helped clear plates without being asked, which Eliza suspected was more about avoiding awkward conversation than helpfulness. Finally, it was just Eliza and Caleb in the kitchen. He sat at the table nursing cold coffee while she washed dishes. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, not quite companionable, but not entirely hostile either. She'll come around, Caleb said finally. Maybe. She's had to be strong. After her mother passed, someone had to hold things together. Eliza dried a plate carefully. She's 17. That's too young to be holding a household together. Didn't have a choice. I know. Eliza set the plate aside. But she has a choice now. The question is whether she'll take it. Caleb looked at her then, really looked, like he was trying to figure out what kind of woman he'd brought into his house. You seem sure of yourself. I'm not. Eliza turned to face him. I'm not sure of anything, Mr. Mercer, but I'm here, and I signed a contract, and I don't quit just because things are hard. So whether your daughter likes me or not, whether this town accepts me or not, I'm going to do the job I came here to do. Which is? Keep your children alive through winter. Get this house running properly. Help you hold this ranch together. That's what you asked for in your letter. That's what I'm going to give you. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of respect. Fair enough, he said. That night, Eliza lay in her narrow bed listening to the house settle around her. Footsteps above. The creak of old wood. Wind rattling the window frames. Somewhere down the hall, one of the children coughed. Farther away, an animal made some kind of sound she couldn't identify. This was her life now. This house. This family. This hard, unforgiving place that had already killed one woman and would probably try to kill her too if she let it. She thought about the train, about how easy it would be to just leave, to write a polite note and disappear like the woman before her. Instead, she got up, lit the lantern, and pulled out her sewing kit. There was work to do. The children's winter coats were in worse shape than she'd thought. She'd noticed earlier when they'd come in for supper. Thin fabric, holes poorly mended, hems that had been let down so many times there wasn't any material left to work with. She couldn't fix everything in one night. But she could start. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through her window, Eliza had reinforced the seams on 3 coats and started patching the 4th. Her eyes burned. Her fingers ached. She was exhausted in a way that went bone deep, and she had never felt more certain that she was exactly where she needed to be. Because Eliza Vance had learned something in the years since her own life fell apart. Survival wasn't about being the strongest or the toughest or the one who never broke. Survival was about getting up every morning and doing the next necessary thing, even when everything in you screamed to stop. It was about making bread when you wanted to cry, mending coats when your hands wouldn't stop shaking, setting a table properly because small acts of care mattered, even when nobody seemed to notice. The people of Blackthorn Ridge thought she was weak. Let them. She'd been called worse by better people. What mattered was the work. What mattered was showing up. What mattered was proving, not to them, but to herself, that she could build something worth having out of the wreckage she'd been given. The sun came up cold and bright. Eliza washed her face in icy water, changed into a clean dress, and went downstairs to start breakfast. By the time the household began to stir, the kitchen was warm and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Eliza had found oats and honey and a bit of dried fruit, which she'd turned into something that resembled a proper hot breakfast. One by one, the children appeared. Thomas first, looking surprised to find her already up and working, then Ben and Daniel, drawn by the smell of food. Annie came down dragging a rag doll and climbed immediately into the chair next to Eliza, like they'd already established this as her territory. Mara was last. She stopped in the doorway, took in the scene, the set table, the hot food, Eliza standing at the stove, and something complicated crossed her face. "Good morning," Eliza said. Mara didn't respond, just took her seat and stared at her plate. Caleb came in from the barn, bringing cold air and the smell of livestock with him. He looked at the breakfast spread, then at Eliza, then back at the food. "You didn't have to—" "Yes," Eliza said again. "I did." They ate. After breakfast, Eliza announced her plans. "I'm going to reorganize the pantry properly today. After that, I'll need to see what winter stores you have and what still needs to be put by. Mr. Mercer, if you could spare someone to show me where things are kept, I'd appreciate it." "Thomas can help," Caleb said. "I'll help too," Annie announced. "Annie, you're too little," Mara started. "I'm not too little. I can carry things. I'm strong." Eliza caught Mara's eye. "I'd be glad for Annie's help. Even strong girls need assistance sometimes." It was the right thing to say. Annie beamed. Mara's expression softened just fractionally, and Thomas looked relieved to have clear direction about what needed doing. The day unfolded in hard work. Eliza discovered that the ranch's food storage was even more chaotic than the kitchen. Supplies scattered across multiple buildings with no clear organization. Root vegetables stored improperly. Preserved goods past their useful date. Entire sections of the smokehouse that should have been full but weren't. "How have you been making it through winters?" she asked Thomas as they sorted through barrels of questionable grain. He shrugged. "We just make do, I guess. Hunting when we can. Buying supplies in town when Pa has the money. That's expensive." "Yeah." Thomas lifted another barrel, checking the contents. "But we haven't had anyone to do the preserving properly. Not since Mama died. Mara tries, but she's got so much else to manage." Eliza made mental notes. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. The ranch had been slowly degrading for months, maybe longer. Every system had small failures that had compounded over time. But small failures could be corrected. One thing at a time. She spent 3 days reorganizing food storage alone. Then another 2 days assessing what needed to be preserved before winter truly set in. She found wild apples on trees near the property line and turned them into preserves. She inventoried the smokehouse and identified what needed immediate attention. The children watched her work with increasing curiosity. Ben started asking questions about how she knew which vegetables would keep and which wouldn't. Daniel appeared one morning with a basket of late-season berries he'd found and wanted to know if they could be saved. Even Samuel, tiny and mostly silent, began following her around like a shadow. Only Mara kept her distance. But Eliza noticed things. The way Mara watched when Eliza taught Annie how to properly seal preserving jars. The way she lingered in doorways when Eliza explained crop rotation to the boys. The way she'd pick up tasks Eliza had started and finish them correctly without being asked. The girl was listening, even if she wasn't ready to admit it yet. 2 weeks after Eliza arrived, the first real cold snap hit. She woke to frost on the windows and a chill in the air that spoke of winter's arrival. Downstairs, she found Caleb already dressed for outside work, layering on coats. "Going to move the cattle to lower pasture," he said. "Storm's coming. Need to get them settled before it hits." "How long will you be gone?" "Most of the day, maybe into evening if the herd gives us trouble." "The children?" "Mara knows what to do." But when Caleb left, taking Thomas and Ben with him, Eliza discovered that Mara's knowledge of what to do didn't extend to the animals in the near barn. The milk cow was clearly uncomfortable, shifting weight and making distressed sounds. The chickens were fighting over inadequate food, and one of the horses had something wrong with its hoof that made it limp when it walked. Eliza found Mara in the kitchen, looking overwhelmed. "I know," Mara said before Eliza could speak. "I know the cow needs milking and the chickens need feeding and something's wrong with the horse. I know, but I can't be everywhere at once and the little ones need watching and there's laundry that should have been done yesterday, and— Mara, Eliza said quietly, breathe. Don't tell me to breathe. You don't understand. You've only been here 2 weeks. You don't know how much there is to do, how impossible it all is. You're right. I don't know everything. But I know enough to see that you're trying to do the work of 3 people, and that's not sustainable. Eliza pulled on her coat. I'll handle the animals. You get the laundry started and keep an eye on Annie and Samuel. When I'm done outside, I'll help with whatever's left. You don't know anything about livestock. No, Eliza agreed. But I know how to learn. And I know that horse isn't going to get better by itself. She left before Mara could argue. The barn was cold and smelled like hay and manure and animal warmth. Eliza stood just inside the door and let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light, taking inventory of the situation. The milk cow first. That was most urgent. Eliza had milked cows before, years ago, but she was rusty. Her hands fumbled at first, drawing annoyed sounds from the animal, but muscle memory eventually kicked in, and the rhythm came back. It took longer than it should have, but she got it done. The chickens were easier, just scattered grain and fresh water. Though she noticed their coop was poorly insulated and made a mental note to address that before true winter arrived. The horse was harder. Eliza approached slowly, talking in a low, steady voice. The animal was nervous, ears back, shifting weight off the injured hoof. She managed to get close enough to see the problem. A rock wedged deep in the shoe, causing pain with every step. She didn't have the tools or knowledge to fix it properly, but she could make it more comfortable until Caleb got back. Moving carefully, she located a hoof pick in the tack room and managed, after several false starts and one near kick, to remove most of the debris. The horse wasn't healed, but it was better. That would have to be enough for now. By the time she finished with the animals, her hands were shaking from cold and effort. She returned to the house to find Mara standing at the kitchen window, watching. You did it, Mara said. Not quite a question. I did what needed doing. The horse usually doesn't let strangers near it. I wasn't a stranger. I was someone who was trying to help. Eliza hung up her coat. Animals know the difference. Something shifted in Mara's expression. The wall she'd been maintaining cracked just slightly. My mother could do anything, she said quietly. Animals, preserving, sewing, cooking, managing the whole household. She made it look easy, and I've been trying so hard to be like her, but everything I do just falls apart. Nothing's ever good enough. Eliza crossed the kitchen and stood beside Mara at the window. Your mother had years to learn all those things. You're 17. You've been trying to do it all alone while also grieving her loss. That's not the same as failing. That's just being human. I don't want to be human. I want to be strong enough to keep everyone safe. You are strong enough, Eliza said, but strength doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means knowing when to accept help. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then so softly Eliza almost didn't hear it. Will you teach me? How you organize things? How you knew what to do with the horse? How you make everything seem less impossible? And there it was, the crack in the wall becoming a door. Yes, Eliza said. I'll teach you, but you have to promise me something. What? Stop trying to be your mother. Be Mara instead. That's who this family needs. Mara's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, but she nodded. That night, when Caleb returned cold and exhausted from moving cattle, he found the evening meal ready, the house warm, and his eldest daughter working beside Eliza in the kitchen, like maybe, just maybe, they'd reached some kind of truce. He didn't comment on it, but Eliza saw the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, the way some of the tension left his face. Small changes, small victories. That's how you saved a dying ranch. One day, one task, one person at a time. The truce between Eliza and Mara lasted exactly 4 days before the town women showed up. They arrived on a gray Thursday morning in a wagon driven by the same woman who'd sized Eliza up on the train platform. Her name, Eliza had learned, was Margaret Whitmore, and she considered herself the unofficial authority on how things should be done in Blackthorn Ridge. With her came 3 other women, all wearing expressions that suggested they were doing Eliza a tremendous favor by acknowledging her existence. Eliza was in the yard hanging laundry when she heard the wagon approach. Her hands were raw from lye soap and cold water. Her dress was damp from the work, and she probably looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd been up since before dawn doing the endless tasks required to keep a household running. Margaret climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone who wanted everyone to notice how difficult the journey had been. "Mrs. Mercer?" she called out, getting the name wrong deliberately. "We've come to welcome you properly to the community." Eliza hung the shirt she was holding and turned to face them. "It's Mrs. Vance, and you're very kind." "Oh, of course. Vance." Margaret's smile was sharp around the edges. "We brought some things we thought you might need. It's traditional when a new woman arrives. Though I must say, you're settling in rather quickly." The other women were already unloading baskets from the wagon. They moved toward the house without waiting for invitation, like they owned the place. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and followed them inside. The kitchen, which she'd spent 2 weeks organizing into something functional, was suddenly full of uninvited guests making themselves at home. Margaret took the best chair without asking. The others arranged their baskets on the table Eliza had just scrubbed clean. "We heard you've been making quite a few changes around here," one of the women said. Her name was Helen, and she had the kind of voice that made everything sound like criticism. "New storage arrangements, different meal schedules. Some people are saying you're trying to do things the Eastern way instead of how we do them out here." "I'm just trying to keep the household running," Eliza said carefully. "Of course you are, dear." Margaret opened her basket and began pulling out items. "But there's a certain way things are done in frontier country. We wouldn't want you to exhaust yourself trying to maintain standards that simply aren't practical this far from civilization." The implication was clear. Eliza's standards were unrealistic. Her methods were wrong. She was trying too hard to be something she wasn't. The third woman, younger than the others and clearly nervous, pulled out a jar of something that might have been preserves. "We brought some things to help stock your pantry. Margaret makes the best apple butter in the valley." "That's very thoughtful," Eliza said, even though she'd made 3 jars of her own apple butter just 2 days ago. "We also wanted to talk to you about Sundays," Margaret continued. "The whole community gathers after services. It's expected that the ranch families contribute food. We have a system. Certain families bring certain dishes. We'd hate for you to embarrass the Mercer name by not knowing the proper procedures." Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't a welcome visit. This was a power play. These women were here to establish the hierarchy, to make sure Eliza understood her place at the bottom of it. "I appreciate the guidance," she said, keeping her voice level. "Oh, and one more thing." Helen leaned forward conspiratorially. "We heard you've been handling the livestock, the animals and such. That's really not appropriate work for a lady. You should leave those tasks to the ranch hands." "The ranch hands are busy with—" "Nevertheless," Margaret's tone went firm. "People talk, Mrs. Vance, a woman mucking about in barns, working like common labor. It reflects poorly. On you, on the Mercer family, on all of us, really. We have certain standards to maintain." Before Eliza could respond, Mara appeared in the kitchen doorway. The girl had clearly been listening from the hallway. Her face was flushed with anger, her hands clenched at her sides. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice tight. "How kind of you to visit." "Mara, dear." Margaret's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy if it wasn't quite so condescending. "We were just helping Mrs. Vance understand how things work here. I know it must be difficult for you, having a stranger in your mother's house." "Don't!" Mara's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. "Don't talk about my mother. You didn't come here to help. You came here to judge and criticize and make Mrs. Vance feel unwelcome. I heard everything you said." The kitchen went very quiet. Margaret's face hardened. "Young lady, you're overwrought. We're only trying to—" "Leave," Mara said flatly. "Take your baskets and your advice and leave. Mrs. Vance doesn't need your help. We're managing just fine." "Mara," Helen's voice was sharp, "you're being incredibly rude to women who are only trying to show Christian charity. I said leave." The women gathered their things in offended silence. Margaret was the last to go, pausing at the door to deliver one final shot. "You'll regret this, Mara Mercer, both of you. This town takes care of its own, but only when people know their place and show proper respect. You do well to remember that." Then they were gone, leaving behind an awkward silence and several baskets they'd apparently forgotten in their hurry to exit with dignity intact. Eliza and Mara stood in the kitchen, listening to the wagon pull away. "You didn't have to do that," Eliza said finally. Yes, I did. Mara's hands were still shaking. They had no right to come in here and talk to you like that. This is our home, yours now too, and they don't get to tell us how to run it. They'll make things difficult now, for both of us. Let them. Mara turned to face Eliza directly. I spent the last 6 months trying to please everyone, trying to be what the town expected, trying to manage this house the way they thought it should be managed. And you know what? We were failing anyway. The pantry was a mess. The animals were suffering. The little ones were hungry half the time because I couldn't keep up with everything. She took a shaky breath. Then you showed up, and in 2 weeks, you've done more to fix things than I managed in 6 months. Because you actually know what you're doing, and you're not afraid to work. So if Margaret Whitmore wants to criticize that, she can go straight to hell. It was the first time Eliza had heard Mara swear. She couldn't help it. She laughed. What's funny? Mara demanded. Nothing. Everything. Eliza picked up one of the abandoned baskets and started putting away the items inside. I just never expected to have you defending me. 2 weeks ago, you wanted me gone. 2 weeks ago, I thought you were another weak woman who'd run away the first time things got hard. Mara grabbed another basket and began helping. But you're not weak. You're just quiet. There's a difference. Your mother, Eliza said carefully. Would she have approved of you sending those women away like that? Mara was silent for a long moment, putting away jars with more force than necessary. My mother would have served them tea and smiled and let them say whatever they wanted because that's what you did. You were polite. You were gracious. You never caused trouble. Her voice went rough. And then she died anyway, and none of those women lifted a finger to actually help us. They brought food for a week after the funeral and then disappeared, left us to figure everything out alone. People don't always know what to do with grief. They knew enough to judge us for not managing better. Mara slammed a jar down on the counter. They knew enough to whisper about how the Mercer Ranch was falling apart, how Pa couldn't handle things without a wife, how I was too young and too proud to ask for help. But none of them actually offered any real help, just criticism dressed up as concern. Eliza understood that kind of help. She'd received plenty of it herself after her husband died. So what do we do now? She asked. Now? Mara straightened up and met Eliza's eyes. Now we keep doing exactly what we've been doing. We get this ranch running properly. We get the animals healthy and the pantry stocked and the children taken care of. And we show the whole damn town that we don't need their approval to survive. It was a good plan. It was also naive in the way that only 17-year-olds could be naive, believing that hard work and determination were enough to overcome social consequences. But Eliza didn't say that. Instead, she said, all right, then we'd better get back to work. The consequences arrived faster than expected. That Sunday, when the Mercer family arrived for services, the other women made a point of turning their backs. Conversation stopped when Eliza approached. No one sat in the pew beside them. After the service, during the community meal, Margaret Whitmore held court at the far end of the gathering space, surrounded by sympathetic listeners who kept glancing over at Eliza and Mara with expressions of scandalized disapproval. Caleb noticed. What happened? He asked Eliza quietly as they stood at the edge of the gathering, plates of food untouched. Nothing important. Eliza. She told him. About the visit, about Mara's response, about the clear social exile they were now facing. Caleb's jaw tightened. I'll talk to them. No. Eliza put a hand on his arm. That'll just make it worse. Let them have their gossip. It'll die down eventually. And if it doesn't, then we deal with it. But we don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us beg for acceptance. Across the room, Annie had gravitated toward a group of other young children. They were playing some kind of game, laughing and running between the tables. But when Annie tried to join in, one of the mothers called her child away with a sharp word. Then another. Within minutes, Annie stood alone, confusion written all over her small face. Eliza watched the little girl's expression crumble. Excuse me, she said to Caleb, and crossed the room before he could stop her. She knelt down beside Annie and spoke quietly. How about we go home? I was thinking of making those sugar cookies you liked, the ones with cinnamon. But I wanted to play. Annie's voice was small and hurt. I know, sweetheart, but sometimes people aren't kind, and when that happens, we don't waste our time trying to make them like us. We go spend our time with people who already do. Annie's lower lip trembled. Is it because of me? Did I do something wrong? No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. Some adults just forget how to be decent people, and they pass that along to their children. But that's not your fault. Annie wrapped her arms around Eliza's neck and held on tight. Eliza carried her out of the gathering hall with Mara and the boys following behind. Caleb brought up the rear, his face dark with suppressed anger. They rode home in heavy silence. That night, after the children were in bed, Caleb found Eliza in the kitchen preparing bread dough for the next morning. "This is my fault," he said without preamble. "I brought you here, put you in this position. You didn't put me anywhere. I chose to come. You didn't choose to be treated like that." Eliza punched down the dough harder than necessary. "I've been treated worse. I can handle Margaret Whitmore and her circle of gossips. But the children will learn that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone. That's not the worst lesson they could learn." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "I should have warned you about how things work here, about the town politics and the social rules and all the unwritten expectations. Would it have changed anything? Maybe. Probably not." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Margaret's been trying to run this town since her husband died 10 years ago. She decides who's acceptable and who isn't. Cross her, and you're out." "Then I guess we're out." "You say that like it doesn't matter." Eliza stopped working the dough and looked at him directly. "It matters. But not as much as running this ranch properly matters. Not as much as keeping your children fed and healthy matters. Not as much as making sure you all survive the winter matters." She dusted flour off her hands. "I didn't come here to make friends, Mr. Mercer. I came here to work. If the town doesn't like how I do that work, they're welcome to their opinions. But they don't get to tell me how to manage this household." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. "You sound like her sometimes." "Who?" "My wife. Elizabeth." He said the name carefully, like it still hurt. "She didn't care much what people thought either. Drove Margaret crazy." It was the first time he'd really talked about his late wife. Eliza didn't push, just waited to see if he'd continue. "Elizabeth was strong," he said finally. "Not loud strong, but solid, like you. She'd make a decision and stick to it, even when everyone said she was wrong. Even when I said she was wrong." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She was usually right, too. Made me look like a fool more than once." "I'm sure you returned the favor. More than once." The smile faded. "I miss her. Even now, 2 years later. I miss having someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who understood the work and the worry and didn't need me to explain everything." Eliza understood what he was really saying. This wasn't romance. It was partnership. Two people trying to survive in a place that demanded everything you had and then asked for more. "I'm not her," Eliza said quietly. "I can't be her. But I can be someone you don't have to explain things to. Someone who understands the work." "I know." Caleb stood up. "And that's enough. More than enough, actually." He left her alone in the kitchen with her bread dough and her thoughts. The social exile continued through the following weeks. When Eliza went to the general store for supplies, the clerk served her last, even when she'd arrived first. Other customers crowded in front of her like she didn't exist. The prices quoted to her were higher than what other people paid. She endured it all without comment. At the feed and grain store, the owner made her wait in the cold while he handled other customers. When he finally deigned to help her, he informed her that there would be a delay in delivering her order. "How long of a delay?" Eliza asked. "Hard to say. Could be a week. Could be 2. We're very busy this time of year." "I see. And if I paid extra for faster service?" "Wouldn't matter. Like I said, we're busy." Eliza looked at the nearly empty store, at the owner's smug expression, and understood exactly what was happening. "Then I suppose I'll have to find another supplier," she said calmly. His smile faltered. "Nearest other suppliers, 2 days' ride." "Then I'd better get started." She left before he could respond. That evening, she told Caleb she needed to make a trip to Creston Falls, the next town over. "That's 4 days round trip," he said, concerned. "The weather's getting unpredictable. Roads might be bad. The weather's going to get worse before it gets better. If we wait until spring, we won't have the supplies we need to make it through winter." "I could go." "You're needed here. The cattle still need moving to winter grazing. The fencing repairs can't wait, and someone needs to watch the children. Eliza, see, I can do this, Caleb. I've made long trips before. I'll take the wagon, stock up on everything we need, and be back before you know it. He didn't like it, but he couldn't argue with the logic. 2 days later, Eliza set out before dawn with a wagon, 2 horses, and a list of supplies that would see them through the worst of winter. The trip was long and cold and lonely. She stopped the first night at a way station run by an elderly couple who asked no questions and charged fair prices. The second day brought her to Creston Falls, a town twice the size of Blackthorn Ridge, and significantly less concerned with the social politics of frontier life. The merchants there were happy to take her money. They loaded her wagon with grain, preserved goods, medical supplies, fabric, tools, and everything else on her list. No judgment, no delays, just business. Eliza spent one night at a boarding house, then started the journey home. The weather turned on the second day. What started as light snow became a steady fall, then a near whiteout. The temperature dropped sharply. Wind cut through Eliza's coat like it wasn't there. The horses struggled against the storm, their breath coming in great clouds of vapor. Eliza should have stopped, should have found shelter and waited out the storm. But she could see the mountains in the distance when the snow cleared enough. Could calculate how close she was to home, and she'd promised Caleb she'd be back in 4 days. She pushed on. By the time she realized her mistake, the storm had turned vicious. Snow came down so thick she could barely see the horses' heads. The road disappeared beneath white. Cold seeped into her bones despite the blankets she'd wrapped around herself. The wagon wheel hit something hidden beneath the snow. A rock? A rut? She never knew. And lurched violently to the side. Eliza heard the crack before she felt the wagon tilt. The axle, broken or badly damaged. She managed to get the horses stopped and climbed down to assess the damage. The back left wheel canted at an angle that made her stomach drop. Not completely broken, but damaged enough that continuing would likely destroy it entirely. She was stranded. Miles from anywhere, in a blizzard with a broken wagon and darkness coming on fast. For the first time since arriving in Blackthorn Ridge, Eliza felt genuine fear. She couldn't leave the wagon, all the supplies were there, and losing them meant the ranch might not make it through winter. But she couldn't fix the wheel alone, and staying here meant freezing to death before morning. The horses stamped nervously, picking up on her fear. Think. She needed to think. There had been a line shack marked on the map Caleb had given her, maybe 2 miles back, a shelter for ranch hands during cattle drives. It wouldn't be much, but it would be out of the wind. But that meant leaving the wagon unguarded in the storm. Eliza stood in the snow, making calculations. The supplies versus her life. The ranch's needs versus immediate survival. Elizabeth wouldn't have hesitated, she thought. Caleb's first wife would have known exactly what to do. But Eliza wasn't Elizabeth. She was just herself, cold and scared and very aware that she might have made a fatal mistake by pushing on through the storm. She was still standing there, paralyzed by indecision, when she heard something over the wind. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast. Through the snow came 3 riders, bundled against the cold. For a moment, Eliza couldn't make out who they were. Then the lead rider pulled up beside the wagon and pushed back his scarf. Caleb. "What the hell were you thinking?" he shouted over the wind. "Traveling in this?" "The wheel broke. I can see that. We need to get you to shelter. Now." "The supplies. Thomas, Ben, secure that wagon as best you can. We'll come back for it when the storm clears." The boys moved with practiced efficiency, covering the wagon bed with canvas and staking it down against the wind. Meanwhile, Caleb half-lifted Eliza onto his horse. "Hold on," he ordered, and spurred the horse forward. The line shack was exactly where the map indicated. A rough structure barely big enough for 4 people, but it had walls and a roof and a small stove. The boys got a fire going while Caleb helped Eliza inside. She was shaking so badly she could barely stand. "Sit down before you fall down," Caleb ordered, pushing her toward the rough bench near the stove. "I'm fine. You're half frozen and in shock. Sit." She sat. Thomas got the fire burning properly while Ben unpacked blankets and what looked like emergency supplies from their saddlebags. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. "How did you find me?" Eliza asked once feeling started returning to her fingers. "Weather turned bad yesterday. I knew you'd try to push through rather than wait it out." Caleb was checking the horses, making sure they were secured against the storm. Took the boys and came looking. Found your tracks about an hour ago. You could have died. All of you coming out in this. Yeah, well. He came back inside and started making coffee on the small stove. So could you. At least this way, if we die together. It wasn't romantic. It was stated as plain fact, which somehow made it more meaningful than poetry. They waited out the storm in the tiny shack, the four of them crowded together in the small space. Thomas and Ben eventually fell asleep wrapped in blankets near the stove. Eliza and Caleb sat up, keeping the fire fed, listening to wind howl outside. I'm sorry, Eliza said finally. This was foolish. It was necessary, Caleb corrected. Or at least you thought it was necessary. That's different than foolish. I wanted to prove I could handle things, that I didn't need help from the town. You don't need to prove anything to those people. I needed to prove it to myself. Caleb poured more coffee and handed her a cup. You know what Elizabeth used to say? She said that strength wasn't about never needing help. It was about knowing when to ask for it. I should have waited, should have asked you to come with me from the start. Probably. He took a drink from his own cup. But you didn't, and now we're here, and there's no changing it. So instead of beating yourself up, how about you tell me what supplies you managed to get before you nearly killed yourself in a blizzard? Despite everything, Eliza smiled. Everything on the list, plus some extras I found at good prices. Well then, worth it. We're trapped in a line shack during a blizzard. My wagon's broken. And you think it was worth it? You got the supplies. You're alive. The boys and I got some practice with storm navigation. I'd say we came out ahead. It was such a practical, unsentimental assessment that Eliza couldn't help but laugh. What? Caleb asked. Nothing, just, you're very different from what I expected when I answered your letter. Yeah? What did you expect? Someone harder, more demanding, less, she searched for the word, reasonable. Reasonable's a new one. Most people use different words. What words? Stubborn, difficult, impossibly picky about how things should be done. That too, Eliza agreed, but also reasonable. They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside. Eventually, Caleb spoke again. I'm glad you came, Eliza. Even with all the trouble it's caused. Even with the town turning on you. I'm glad you answered my letter and got on that train and didn't turn back when you saw what a mess this place was. I almost did turn back, about a dozen times. But you didn't. No, she agreed. I didn't. The storm finally broke near dawn. They emerged from the line shack to find the world transformed into white silence. The wagon was buried but intact. Together, the four of them managed to dig it out and assess the damage. The axle was cracked but not completely broken. With careful driving and some temporary bracing, they could probably get it back to the ranch. It took most of the day. By the time they pulled into the ranch yard, the sun was setting and the rest of the children were frantic with worry. Mara stood on the porch with Annie and Samuel, her face pale with fear that shifted to relief, then anger as soon as she saw them. Where have you been? She demanded. You said 4 days. It's been 5.5. We thought... Her voice broke. We thought something happened. Something did happen, Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. But we handled it. Everyone's fine. Mara's eyes went to Eliza, searching for confirmation. We're fine, Eliza agreed. Just a little adventure with a broken wagon and a blizzard. Nothing we couldn't manage. Nothing you couldn't? Mara's voice went high and sharp. You could have died. All of you. And for what? Supplies we could have gotten somewhere else? There was nowhere else, Eliza said quietly. Not without giving in to people who wanted to see us fail. And I won't do that. Something in her tone must have convinced Mara, because the girl's anger deflated into something that looked like understanding. You're as stubborn as he is, she said, jerking her head toward her father. Probably, Eliza admitted. Well then, Mara came down from the porch and started helping unload supplies. At least that means you'll fit in around here. It took 3 days to unload and organize everything Eliza had brought back from Creston Falls. The pantry overflowed with goods. The root cellar filled up properly for the first time in months. The medicine cabinet restocked with supplies that might save lives before winter ended. Word spread quickly about Eliza's trip. Some people in town were impressed. Others thought it proved she was reckless and unsuitable for frontier life. Margaret Whitmore's faction used it as evidence that Eliza was a dangerous influence on the Mercer family. Eliza didn't care anymore. She had work to do, and that work didn't include worrying about the opinions of people who'd already decided to hate her. 3 weeks after the supply trip, as November gave way to December, the first real crisis hit. It started with one of the younger boys, Daniel, developing a cough. Just a cough at first. Nothing alarming. Children got coughs all the time. But then Ben started coughing. Then Annie. Then Samuel. Within 2 days, 4 of the 6 children were sick with what looked like the beginning of a serious respiratory infection. Eliza had seen this before. Had nursed her late husband through something similar right before he died. She knew how fast it could turn bad, especially in winter when bodies were already stressed from cold and poor nutrition. She quarantined the sick children immediately, keeping them separated from Mara and Thomas, who showed no symptoms yet. She made poultices and teas from the medical supplies she'd bought. She sat up nights monitoring fevers and breathing, but it kept getting worse. By the end of the first week, all 4 sick children were struggling. High fevers, labored breathing, the terrible wet cough that signaled fluid in the lungs. Caleb wanted to ride to town for the doctor. "He won't come," Mara said flatly. "Not for us, not after what happened with Mrs. Whitmore. He's a doctor, he has to come. He doesn't have to do anything, and even if he would come, he's 3 hours away minimum. In this weather, probably longer." She was right, and they all knew it, which meant it fell to Eliza to keep the children alive. She worked with a grim determination that left no room for fear. Steam treatments to ease breathing, poultices to reduce fever, careful monitoring through long nights when every breath the children took sounded like it might be their last. Mara helped without being asked, learning quickly what needed doing and when. Thomas took over the outdoor work completely, managing livestock and maintaining the property while his father stayed close to the house. And Caleb? Caleb paced like a caged animal, helpless in the face of illness that might take his children the same way it had taken his wife. The worst night was exactly 1 week into the illness. Little Samuel's fever spiked dangerously high. His breathing turned ragged and irregular. Several times, Eliza thought they'd lost him. She sat beside his bed for 12 straight hours, applying cool cloths, monitoring his breathing, willing him to hold on. Caleb stood in the doorway watching, his face carved from stone. "Is he going to die?" he asked finally, his voice raw. "Not if I can help it." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Samuel's fever finally broke. His breathing eased into something closer to normal sleep. The crisis wasn't over, but he turned a corner. Eliza sat back in her chair, every muscle in her body screaming from exhaustion. Caleb crossed the room and put a hand on her shoulder. Just that. A simple touch that said more than words could have. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of danger. But we're not in the worst of it anymore. And that's because of you." By the end of the second week, all 4 children were recovering. Still weak, still coughing, but clearly on the mend. Eliza had barely slept in 14 days. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her hands shook from exhaustion, and there were dark circles under her eyes that made her look 10 years older. But the children were alive. And somewhere during those 2 weeks of crisis, something fundamental shifted in the Mercer household. The children stopped seeing Eliza as an outsider and started seeing her as someone who'd fought to keep them alive when everything else had failed. Mara stopped guarding her mother's memory quite so fiercely and started accepting that maybe having help wasn't the same as betrayal. And Caleb stopped viewing their arrangement as purely practical and started seeing it as a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. None of it was spoken out loud, but everyone felt it. The day Annie was finally well enough to come downstairs for a real meal, she climbed into the chair beside Eliza and announced, "You're my favorite." "Annie," Mara warned. "It's true, she stayed up all night when I was sick. She made me feel better. She's my favorite." Eliza smoothed the little girl's hair. "I'm very honored, but you should probably save the title of favorite for someone more important." "You are important," Samuel piped up from across the table. His voice was still raspy from coughing, but his eyes were bright and determined. "You saved us." "I just did what needed doing." "You always say that," Thomas observed, "but it's more than that. You could have let the doctor handle it. You could have done less. But you didn't. Eliza looked around the table at 6 children who had gone from suspicious and hostile to something else entirely, something that looked almost like family. "Well," she said finally, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I suppose that's what people do when they care about each other. They show up and do what needs doing. Even when it's hard," Daniel added, "especially when it's hard." That night, after the children were in bed, Caleb found Eliza in the kitchen once again. She was preparing bread dough for the next day, hands moving through familiar motions while her mind wandered. "You should rest," he said. "I've been resting for 2 days. Any more rest and I'll forget how to work." He pulled out a chair and sat down, watching her work. "The children love you now. You know that, right?" "They're grateful. That's different." "No, they love you. All of them. Even Mara, though she'd probably never admit it out loud." He paused. "I'm trying to say thank you. For everything. For coming here, for staying when the town turned on you, for saving my children's lives, for—" He stopped, searching for words. "For being exactly what we needed when we needed it most." Eliza kept working the dough, using the rhythm to steady herself. "You're welcome." "That's it? Just you're welcome? What else do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Maybe that you're glad you came? That you don't regret answering my letter?" She did stop then, turning to face him fully. "I don't regret it. Even with everything that's happened. Even with the town treating us like we're diseased. Even with nearly dying in a blizzard and nursing 4 sick children for 2 weeks straight. I don't regret coming here." "Why not?" "Because, for the first time in 2 years, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. Like I'm building something real instead of just surviving day to day. That's worth a lot of hardship." Caleb stood up and crossed to where she stood. For a moment she thought he might touch her, might pull her into an embrace or something equally overwhelming. Instead, he just nodded. "Good," he said, "because we're not even halfway through winter yet, and if this is any indication, it's going to be a hell of a season." He was right about that. Winter was just getting started, and so were the real problems. The cattle started dying 3 days before Christmas. Caleb found the first one early morning while checking the winter pasture. A young heifer collapsed near the fence line, eyes glazed and foam at her mouth. By the time he rode back with Thomas to examine her properly, 2 more were showing symptoms. Eliza was kneading bread when they came through the kitchen door, their faces telling the story before words could. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad." Caleb stripped off his gloves. "Never seen anything like it. Animals just collapse. Breathing goes shallow, then they're gone within hours." "Could be poison," Thomas offered. "Maybe they got into something toxic." "In winter? With everything frozen?" Caleb shook his head. "This is something else." Eliza wiped flour from her hands. "I need to see them." "Eliza, it's freezing out there, and—" "I need to see them," she repeated firmly. "If this is spreading, we need to know what we're dealing with." The sick cattle were quarantined in a small pen near the eastern barn. 3 animals now, all showing the same symptoms. Labored breathing, excessive salivation, muscle tremors, and a wild look in their eyes that spoke of pain and confusion. Eliza walked the fence line slowly, studying everything. The way the animals moved, what they'd been eating, the condition of the water trough, the ground beneath their hooves. "The feed," she said finally. "When did you last change it?" 2 days ago. "Why? And where did the feed come from?" Caleb and Thomas exchanged glances. "Dorian Pike delivered it last week," Thomas said. "Said he had extra and was selling it cheap since he was overstocked." Something cold settled in Eliza's stomach. "Dorian Pike. You know him?" Caleb asked. "I know of him. One of the ranch hands, right? Works multiple properties?" "Yeah, he does contract work for half the ranches in the valley. Good cattleman, been around forever." Eliza pointed at the nearest sick heifer. "That's not natural illness. Look at the symptoms. Sudden onset, rapid progression, affects the nervous system. That's contamination." "You're saying the feed is poisoned?" "I'm saying something in that feed is making your cattle sick. Whether it's intentional or accidental, I don't know, but we need to stop using it immediately and isolate any animals that might have been exposed." Caleb's jaw tightened. "If we stop using that feed, we'll run short before spring. I bought it specifically because we needed to stretch our supplies. And if we keep using it, you won't have any cattle left to feed." It was brutal logic, but it was true. They spent the rest of the day isolating animals and removing the contaminated feed. By nightfall, they'd identified 7 cattle showing symptoms, with another dozen that might have been exposed. The rest of the herd was moved to a different pasture entirely, away from anything that might be tainted. Eliza worked alongside the men without complaint, mucking out pens and handling frightened animals with a calm efficiency that surprised even Caleb. When Thomas struggled to control a panicked steer, she was the one who managed to gentle it enough to move it safely. "Where'd you learn to handle cattle?" he asked afterwards, breathing hard from exertion. "My father worked in mining camps when I was young. Camps needed food, which meant they kept livestock. I helped sometimes." She didn't elaborate, and Thomas didn't push. That evening, Caleb announced he was riding to town to confront Dorian Pike. "I'm coming with you," Eliza said immediately. "No, this could get ugly." "Then you definitely need a witness, someone who can testify to what was said if it comes to that." "Eliza, I'm the one who identified the problem. I'm the one who can describe the symptoms. You need me there." Mara, who'd been listening from the doorway, spoke up. "She's right, Pa. If Pike tries to deny it, you need someone who knows what they're talking about." Caleb looked between the two women, both wearing identical expressions of stubborn determination, and recognized a losing battle when he saw one. "Fine, but you stay in the wagon and let me do the talking." Eliza agreed, though they both knew she had no intention of staying silent if the situation demanded otherwise. They found Dorian Pike at the saloon, holding court with several other ranch hands and looking entirely too pleased with himself. He was a big man, running to fat but still carrying enough muscle to be dangerous. His face had the florid complexion of someone who drank too much, and his eyes held the kind of calculating intelligence that Eliza instinctively distrusted. Caleb walked straight to his table. Eliza followed 2 steps behind, ignoring the stares of every man in the room. "Dorian, need a word." Pike looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness when he saw Eliza. "Mercer, what can I do for you?" "The feed you sold me last week, where'd you get it?" "Here and there." "Why? Something wrong?" "7 of my cattle are sick, 3 more dead. All of them ate from that feed." The room went quiet. Pike's face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Mercer." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact. The feed is contaminated with something. I need to know where it came from and if you sold it to anyone else." "My feed is fine. Been using the same supplier for years. If your cattle are sick, maybe you should look at how you're managing your herd instead of blaming other people." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "I've been ranching this land for 15 years. I know how to manage cattle, and I know contaminated feed when I see it." "Do you?" Pike's eyes slid to Eliza. "Or did your new wife convince you of that? I heard she's been making all kinds of changes around your place. Maybe she don't know as much as she thinks she does." Eliza felt every eye in the room turn to her. The weight of judgment, of men deciding whether a woman had the right to speak on matters they considered their territory. She spoke anyway. "The symptoms are acute poisoning, sudden onset, neurological impact, rapid deterioration. That's not poor management, that's contamination. And if you sold that same feed to other ranches, they're going to have the same problem within days." Pike stood up slowly, using his size to intimidate. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, coming into my town and making accusations, but I think I'm someone who can recognize poisoned livestock when I see it," Eliza interrupted calmly. "And I think you're someone who either knowingly sold contaminated feed or was too careless to check your supplies properly. Either way, you're responsible." "You got a lot of nerve." "She's got eyes that work," Caleb cut in. "Which is more than I can say for you if you didn't notice something wrong with that feed before selling it." Pike's face went dark red. "Get out, both of you, and take your accusations with you." "Not until you tell me where that feed came from." "I don't have to tell you anything." One of the other men at the table, a weathered rancher Eliza vaguely recognized from town, cleared his throat. "Pike, if there's a problem with feed, we all need to know about it. I bought supplies from you last month. Was it from the same batch?" "There's no problem with the feed," Pike insisted. "Mercer's just looking for someone to blame because his ranch is failing and he's too proud to admit it." "My ranch isn't failing," Caleb said quietly, "but it will be if I lose my whole herd because you're too stubborn to admit you made a mistake." "Mistake?" Pike's voice rose. "The only mistake here is you letting some Eastern woman tell you how to run your operation. Everyone in this valley knows you've lost your mind since she showed up, changing everything, causing trouble with the town women, and now this. Maybe the problem isn't my feed. Maybe the problem is you don't know what the hell you're doing anymore. Caleb moved fast, grabbing Pike by his shirt and slamming him back against the wall hard enough to rattle bottles on the nearby shelf. "Say that again," Caleb growled. "I dare you." "Pa!" Thomas's voice came from the doorway. He must have followed them into town. "Don't. He's not worth it." Caleb held Pike for another long moment, then released him with a shove. "You come near my ranch again, we're going to have a different kind of conversation," he said. "And if I find out you knowingly sold poisoned feed, I'll make sure every rancher in this valley knows exactly what kind of man you are." He turned and walked out, Eliza and Thomas following. They were halfway back to the wagon when a voice called out behind them. "Mrs. Vance, a word?" Eliza turned to find the weathered rancher from the saloon hurrying after them. "Name's Walter Gaines," he said, slightly out of breath. "I run a spread about 10 miles north of here, and I bought feed from Pike 3 weeks ago, same supplier he mentioned." "Have you seen any symptoms in your herd?" Eliza asked. "Not yet, but after what you described in there," he looked worried. "I got 200 head. If that feed is bad, I need to know now." Eliza described the symptoms in detail, how quickly they progressed, what to look for in the early stages. Gaines listened intently, asking smart questions that told her he knew his business. "I'll check my herd first thing tomorrow," he said finally, "and if I find anything, I'll spread the word. Other ranchers deserve to know if there's a problem." "Pike won't like that," Caleb warned. "Pike can go to hell. I've got a ranch to protect." Gaines tipped his hat to Eliza. "Thank you, ma'am, for speaking up. I know it couldn't have been easy walking into that saloon. Someone needed to say it. Well, I'm glad you did." He headed back toward town, leaving the three of them standing in the cold. "That went well," Thomas said dryly. "Could have gone worse," Caleb replied. "At least Gaines is smart enough to take it seriously." "And Pike?" "Pike's going to be a problem, but we'll deal with that when we have to." The ride back to the ranch was tense and quiet. Eliza could feel Caleb's anger radiating off him in waves, barely contained. Thomas sat in the back of the wagon, unusually subdued. When they finally pulled into the ranch yard, Mara was waiting on the porch with news. "2 more cattle down," she said without preamble. "Ben and Daniel are with them now. They're getting worse fast." Caleb swore viciously and headed straight for the barn. Eliza found him there an hour later, standing in the pen with the dying animals, his face a mask of helpless fury. "We're going to lose them all, aren't we?" he said without turning around. "Maybe not all. The ones that weren't exposed might be fine. But the others, the ones that ate the contaminated feed, they're gone." "Probably yes." He turned to face her then, and the pain in his expression was raw. "This ranch was my father's, and his father's before that. 3 generations of Mercers working this land, building something that lasted. And I'm going to be the one who loses it all because I was too trusting and too desperate to check my supplies properly. This isn't your fault, isn't it? I'm the one who bought the feed. I'm the one who didn't inspect it before using it. I'm the one responsible for every decision that gets made on this ranch. You were trying to stretch your resources through a hard winter. That's not stupidity. That's survival. Survival that's going to cost me half my herd." Eliza moved closer, choosing her words carefully. "When my husband died, I lost everything. The house, the business, all the money. Everything we'd built together just gone. And I spent months thinking it was my fault, that I should have seen the signs, should have done something different, should have been smarter or stronger or more prepared." She paused. "But eventually I realized that sometimes bad things happen to good people who are doing their best. Sometimes you make the right decision with the information you have, and it still goes wrong. That's not failure. That's just life being unfair." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "How did you get past it?" "I didn't. Not really. I just learned to carry it differently. And I promised myself that next time I'd be more careful, more suspicious, less trusting of people who had reasons to lie." Like Pike. Like Pike. They stood together in the cold barn, watching dying cattle and facing the hard reality of what this loss would mean. Not just financially, though that was devastating enough, but the blow to Caleb's pride, his sense of himself as someone who could protect and provide for his family. "We'll manage," Eliza said finally. "We'll lose some cattle, and it'll be hard, but we'll manage. The ranch has survived worse." "Has it?" "Your wife died. You raised 6 children alone through the worst grief a person can face. You kept this place running when everyone expected you to fail. This is bad, Caleb, but it's not the worst thing you've survived. He looked at her with something that might have been gratitude or respect, or maybe just exhaustion, so deep it looked like emotion. I'm glad you're here, he said quietly, even with all the trouble it's caused, even with the town hating us and Pike trying to destroy the ranch. I'm glad you answered that letter and stayed when things got hard. So am I. Over the next week, they lost 19 cattle total. The rest of the herd remained healthy, thank God, but the financial impact was catastrophic. Each lost animal represented money they didn't have, resources they couldn't replace, and a narrower margin for survival before spring. But something else happened during that week. Word spread about the contaminated feed. Walter Gaines found similar problems in his own herd and immediately removed the suspect supplies. 3 other ranchers did the same after hearing about the Mercer losses. And slowly, quietly, people started asking questions about Dorian Pike's business practices. It turned out the Mercers weren't the first to have problems with Pike's supplies. There'd been other incidents over the years, small things mostly. A batch of grain that molded too quickly, tools that broke after minimal use, supplies that never quite measured up to what had been promised. But people had overlooked it because Pike was connected. He knew everyone, did business with everyone, and had a knack for making problems disappear before they became serious accusations, until Eliza forced the issue into the open. Margaret Whitmore, predictably, used the cattle deaths as evidence that Eliza was a bad influence. She told anyone who would listen that the ranch had been fine until that Eastern woman arrived and started changing things. But for the first time, not everyone was listening. Walter Gaines publicly defended Eliza's assessment of the contaminated feed. 2 other ranchers who'd also bought from Pike admitted they'd had concerns about his practices. And a few of the younger families in town, the ones who'd been quietly sympathetic to Eliza from the start, began speaking up about the unfair treatment she'd received. The social tide wasn't turning exactly, but it was shifting, just slightly. Christmas came and went quietly. There wasn't money for gifts, and the household was too busy managing the cattle crisis to do much celebrating. But Eliza made a special meal anyway, and the children seemed content with the small things she managed to pull together. Annie got a new doll made from fabric scraps. Samuel received a wooden toy Thomas had carved. The older children got practical items they needed anyway: warm socks, mended gloves, books borrowed from neighbors who'd been kind enough to lend them. It wasn't much, but it was something. On Christmas evening, after the children were in bed, Eliza found Caleb sitting alone in the barn, doing inventory of what remained of their winter feed supplies. It's not enough, he said without looking up. Even with the healthy cattle, we don't have enough feed to get through to spring, not without buying more, and we can't afford that now. Then we'll find another way. What other way? Magic grain that appears out of nowhere? Eliza sat down on a hay bale across from him. There's still wild hay in the upper meadows. Frozen now, but if we can cut through the ice layer, it's edible. And we could trade labor for supplies. I know the Gaines family needs help with their spring planting. We could offer Thomas and Ben in exchange for feed. I won't hire out my sons like day laborers. It's not hiring out, it's bartering. It's what people do when money is tight. Caleb threw down his pencil. Everything is tight. Money, supplies, time, patience. I'm running out of all of it. I know. Do you? Because sometimes I wonder if you really understand what you signed up for. This isn't just hard work and town gossip. This is watching everything I've built my whole life slowly collapse because of decisions I can't take back and problems I can't fix. I understand more than you think, Eliza said quietly. I told you I lost everything when my husband died, but what I didn't tell you is how it happened. Caleb looked up at that. He was a merchant, Eliza continued. Good man, decent provider, but he trusted the wrong business partner. Man named Harrison, who seemed reliable, seemed honest. Turned out Harrison was stealing from the company for years. By the time we found out, the debt was so enormous that when my husband died, everything we owned was seized to pay it off. The house, the furniture, my mother's jewelry, everything. She stared at her hands. I spent months afterwards replaying every conversation, every decision, trying to figure out how I missed the signs, how I could have been so stupid. And you know what I finally realized? What? That I wasn't stupid. Harrison was just a very good liar. And my husband was a good man who wanted to believe the best in people. Sometimes that combination is enough to destroy everything, and there's nothing you can do about it except survive and try not to make the same mistake twice. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Pike is my Harrison. Maybe. Or maybe Pike is just careless and you got caught in the consequences. Either way, the result is the same. We deal with what's in front of us and try to survive it. And if we can't, then we try anyway, because that's what people like us do. There was something almost companionable in the silence that followed. Two people who'd both lost everything once, sitting in a cold barn, planning how to avoid losing everything again. The wild hay idea might work, Caleb said finally, if we can get to it before the next big storm. It'll take all of us working together, but it's possible. Then we'll make it possible. You say that like you believe it. I do believe it. You want to know why? Why? Because I've seen what this family can do when we work together. We got the children through that fever. We managed the supply trip. We identified the contaminated feed before it killed the whole herd. We're not failing, Caleb. We're just fighting hard battles. There's a difference. Something in his expression softened. When did you get so stubborn? I've always been stubborn. You just didn't notice because I'm quiet about it. He almost smiled at that. Fair enough. They worked out a plan over the next hour. 3 days to cut wild hay from the upper meadows. Another week to stockpile enough to supplement their remaining feed supplies through February. Then they'd reassess and figure out the next steps. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a plan. The next morning, Caleb gathered everyone in the kitchen and explained what needed to happen. The children listened with serious faces, understanding that this was important. We're all going to have to work harder than we have been, he said. The hay cutting is going to be brutal, cold, exhausting, and dangerous if we're not careful. But if we can pull this off, we'll have enough feed to keep the remaining cattle alive until spring. And if we can't? Daniel asked. Then we sell the cattle now for whatever we can get and hope it's enough to buy supplies until we can start over with a smaller herd. The children absorbed this soberly. I'll help, Mara said immediately. Me too, Thomas added. One by one, each of them volunteered. Even little Annie insisted she could help somehow, though Eliza privately planned to keep her safely at the house with Samuel. They started the next day. The upper meadows were brutal in winter. Wind cut through every layer of clothing. Ice made footing treacherous, and the frozen hay fought back against every attempt to cut through it. But slowly, agonizingly, they made progress. Eliza worked alongside the men and Mara, swinging a scythe until her shoulders burned and her hands blistered. When the scythe became too heavy, she switched to bundling the cut hay and loading it onto the wagon. When that became too much, she moved to the next task. Nobody complained, nobody quit. Thomas fell through thin ice on the second day and came up soaked and shivering. They got him back to the house immediately, and Mara took over his position without being asked while Eliza made sure he didn't develop hypothermia. Ben cut his hand badly on the third day. Eliza stitched it up with steady hands while he bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. Caleb pushed himself harder than anyone, working from first light until it was too dark to see, then collapsing into bed only to start again the next morning. By the end of the week, they'd cut enough hay to supplement their feed supplies through March. It wasn't quite enough to feel safe, but it was enough to hope. The day they hauled the last load back to the ranch, everyone was too exhausted to celebrate. They just fell into chairs around the kitchen table while Eliza heated soup and sliced bread. We did it, Thomas said, his voice rough with fatigue. We did, Caleb agreed. So the cattle are safe now? Annie asked. Safer, Caleb corrected. We're not out of danger yet, but we bought ourselves time. That night, Eliza sat at her window, looking out at the snow-covered ranch. Every muscle in her body ached. Her hands were covered in blisters and cuts. She was so tired she could barely think straight. But they'd done it. Against impossible odds, against a town that wanted them to fail, against contaminated feed and financial ruin and winter itself, they'd found a way to keep fighting. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived. Quiet, uncertain, grieving everything she'd lost. That woman seemed like someone else now, someone from a different life entirely. This version of Eliza was harder, tougher, more willing to fight for what mattered. And what mattered was this ranch, this family, and proving that survival was possible even when everything seemed designed to destroy you. She was just about to blow out her lamp when she heard footsteps in the hall, a soft knock on her door. Come in. Mara entered, wrapped in a shawl, her face serious. Can't sleep? Eliza asked. No, you? Too tired to sleep, if that makes sense. Mara crossed to the window and stood beside her, looking out at the same view. I wanted to say thank you for everything you did this week. You didn't have to work that hard. You could have stayed at the house with the little ones. So could you. It's different for me. This is my ranch, my family, my responsibility. It's my responsibility too now, Eliza said quietly. Maybe not by blood, but by choice. And that counts for something. Mara was quiet for a moment. My mother would have liked you, I think. You're different from her in a lot of ways, but the important things are the same. You show up. You work. You don't quit when things get hard. It was the first time Mara had said anything positive about her mother, without anger or grief making it complicated. I wish I could have known her, Eliza said honestly. She was better than me at pretty much everything. Cooking, sewing, managing the household. Everyone loved her. The town, the neighbors, everyone. She made it look easy. I doubt it was easy. She probably just made it look that way. Maybe, Mara turned from the window. I spent so long trying to be her that I forgot how to be myself. And I resented you for showing up and being different, for not trying to replace her but also not letting her shadow run everything. You don't have to thank me for that. Yes, I do. Because if you hadn't come, I would have kept trying to be someone I'm not until it destroyed me. You showed me that there's more than one way to be strong. She hugged Eliza quickly, awkwardly, then fled before either of them could get emotional about it. Eliza sat alone in her room for a long time after that, turning Mara's words over in her mind. There's more than one way to be strong. Maybe that was the real lesson of this whole brutal winter. That strength didn't look the same on everyone. That surviving didn't mean never breaking. It meant knowing how to put yourself back together afterward. She'd broken when her husband died, shattered into pieces that took months to gather up again. But here, in this hard place with this complicated family, she'd found a way to be whole again. Not the same as before. Better, maybe. Tougher, definitely. And still fighting. Always fighting, because that's what people like her did. They showed up, they worked, they survived. One day at a time. One crisis at a time. One victory at a time. Until eventually, the victories outnumbered the disasters, and you looked around and realized you'd built something worth keeping. She was almost there. Not quite yet, but almost. And that was enough to keep going. January brought a cold snap so severe that water froze in the well overnight, and the livestock huddled together for warmth in ways Eliza had never seen before. The ranch settled into a rhythm of survival, each day measured by the tasks that kept them alive and the small victories that kept them hoping. Then Walter Gaines showed up at the ranch with news that changed everything. He arrived mid-morning on a Tuesday, his horse steaming in the cold air, his face grim. Caleb was in the barn when Thomas ran to get him, and Eliza watched from the kitchen window as the two men talked in urgent, hushed tones. When they came inside, Gaines looked even more worried than before. Pike's been selling contaminated feed to half the valley, he said without preamble. I've talked to 8 ranchers in the past 2 weeks. 6 of them have had problems. Sick cattle, dying animals, the same symptoms you described. Caleb's face went dark. 6 ranches? At least. Could be more who haven't realized the connection yet. Gaines accepted the coffee Eliza offered him with a nod of thanks. And here's the thing that really concerns me. The feed didn't just go bad by accident. I tracked down Pike's supplier, man out of Creston Falls named Harwick. He swears the grain he sold Pike was clean, properly stored, no contamination. Then how Caleb started. Pike's been cutting it, Gaines said flatly, mixing good grain with cheap filler to stretch his profits. Problem is, the filler he's using has been stored improperly. Moldy, probably toxic. He's been poisoning our herds to make an extra $1 per bushel. Eliza felt her stomach drop. That's not carelessness, that's deliberate. That's what I think too. And if we can prove it, we can shut him down permanently. Maybe even get the territorial marshal involved. Gaines looked at Caleb. But we need evidence, actual proof, not just our word against his. What kind of proof? Samples of the contaminated feed, documentation of the symptoms, written statements from ranchers who bought from Pike and experienced losses. Enough to make a legal case that can't be dismissed. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. That kind of investigation takes time. and resources we don't have. Which is why I'm proposing we pool resources, 4 or 5 ranches working together. We compile the evidence, present it to the territorial authorities, and force an official investigation. Pike has friends in town, Eliza pointed out. Margaret Whitmore's circle will fight this. They'll protect him. Let them try. Gaines set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. I've lost 40 head of cattle because of that bastard. I'm not letting it slide just because he's popular at social gatherings. Eliza looked at Caleb. He's right. If we don't stop Pike now, he'll just keep doing this. More ranches will suffer. More families will lose everything. And if we go after him and lose, we'll be even more isolated than we already are, Caleb countered. The town already hates us. You want to give them more reasons? I want to do the right thing, whether the town likes it or not. Gaines watched this exchange with interest. Your wife's got steel in her spine, Mercer. You're a lucky man. She's not... Caleb stopped himself. We're not... It's complicated. Complicated or not, she's right. We need to act. Gaines stood up. I'm meeting with the other affected ranchers tomorrow at my place. Noon. Come if you want to be part of this. But either way, we're moving forward. After he left, Caleb and Eliza stood in the kitchen facing each other across the table. You know what this means, Caleb said. If we join this, we're declaring war on Pike and everyone who supports him. That's not a small thing. Neither is watching him destroy families because no one has the courage to stop him. It's not about courage. It's about calculating risk. We're barely surviving as it is. We can't afford to make more enemies. Eliza moved around the table to stand directly in front of him. When I came here, you told me you needed someone who could help you survive, someone who could make hard decisions and do what needed doing. Well, this needs doing. We both know it. There are other ways? No, there aren't. You can't negotiate with men like Pike. You can't reason with them or hope they'll suddenly develop a conscience. You have to stop them, publicly, permanently, or they just keep destroying things. Caleb studied her face for a long moment. You sound like you've dealt with men like Pike before. I told you about Harrison, my husband's business partner. He was the same type, charming, connected, willing to destroy other people for profit, and no one stopped him because everyone was afraid of the consequences. So he kept stealing and lying until my husband was dead, and I had nothing. Her voice went hard. I won't let that happen again. Not here. Not to this family. Even if it costs us everything? We already lost almost everything when the cattle died. What's left to lose except our self-respect? Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed, and Eliza could see the moment he made his decision. All right, we'll go to the meeting, we'll help build the case, but if this goes wrong, if we end up losing the ranch because of this, then we'll deal with it, Eliza interrupted, just like we've dealt with everything else, together. The meeting at the Gaines Ranch the next day drew 7 ranchers total, representing nearly half the significant cattle operations in the valley. They gathered in Gaines's dining room, a rough collection of hard men who'd all suffered losses they could barely afford. Eliza was the only woman present. She felt their eyes on her as she entered, the same assessment she'd been receiving since arriving in Blackthorn Ridge, sizing her up, deciding if she belonged, preparing to dismiss anything she said. She was getting very tired of being underestimated. Gaines stood at the head of the table. All right, everyone here has lost cattle to Pike's contaminated feed, some of you more than others. The question is what we do about it. We go to the marshal, one rancher said immediately. File formal complaints. And say what? Another countered. That we think our feed was contaminated? We need proof. Real evidence, not just sick animals. Mrs. Vance identified the contamination pattern, Gaines said, gesturing to Eliza. She's the one who recognized it wasn't natural illness. Maybe she can tell us what kind of evidence would hold up legally. Every eye turned to her. Eliza stood up slowly, refusing to let nervousness show. The symptoms are consistent with mycotoxin poisoning. That's what happens when animals eat moldy grain. It affects the nervous system, causes respiratory distress, and kills quickly if the exposure is severe enough. Can you prove the feed was moldy? Someone asked. If we still have samples, yes. Mycotoxins leave chemical traces that can be tested. But we'd need access to a laboratory, and those aren't common in frontier territory. Nearest one is in Denver, Gaines said. That's a week's travel minimum. Then someone needs to make that trip, Eliza said firmly. We collect samples from everyone who bought Pike's feed. We document the symptoms and losses, and we send it all to Denver for professional analysis. When we get the results back, we have scientific proof, not just anecdotal complaints, the ranchers murmured among themselves. One of them, an older man with a skeptical expression, spoke up. That's expensive. Testing costs money. So does a week's travel. Who's paying for all this? We split the costs, Gaines suggested. 7 ranches, 7 shares. Some of us lost more than others. Why should we pay equally? Because if we don't stop Pike now, he'll keep doing this, and we'll all lose everything eventually, Caleb said, his voice cutting through the growing argument. This isn't about who suffered most. It's about preventing future suffering. The older rancher looked at him. Easy for you to say, Mercer. You've got Mrs. Vance here to help manage your operation. Rest of us are doing everything alone. Then maybe you should focus less on comparing losses and more on solving the actual problem, Eliza said sharply. Every hour we spend arguing is an hour Pike has to cover his tracks or sell more contaminated feed to unsuspecting buyers. The room went quiet. The older rancher's face reddened. Ma'am, I don't particularly care what you appreciate, Eliza interrupted. Your cattle are dead, so are ours, so are everyone's in this room. We can either work together to make sure Pike faces consequences, or we can sit here arguing about who has the right to be most offended while he continues destroying livelihoods. Your choice. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far. The rancher looked ready to explode. Then Gaines laughed. She's got a point, Henderson. We came here to plan action, not compare grievances. Henderson grumbled, but subsided. They spent the next 2 hours hammering out details. Who would collect feed samples? Who would document losses? Who would make the trip to Denver? How they'd split costs? What they'd do if the test results came back inconclusive? By the time they finished, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan, but a solid one. Gaines would coordinate the sample collection. A young rancher named Porter, who had family in Denver, would make the trip and oversee the testing. Everyone would contribute written statements about their losses. And Caleb, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to compile everything into a formal complaint for the territorial authorities. As the meeting broke up, Henderson approached Eliza with an expression that might have been respect or might have been grudging acknowledgement. You've got sharp edges, Mrs. Vance. Didn't expect that. Most people don't. Well, he shifted his weight uncomfortably. Gaines tells me you're the one who figured out the contamination in the first place, that you've got knowledge about livestock that most town women don't bother with. I pay attention, and I remember things. That's not special knowledge. That's just being willing to learn. Still, you probably saved some of our herds by identifying the problem early. He stuck out his hand. So, thank you. Eliza shook his hand, surprised. You're welcome. After he left, Caleb came up beside her. That's the first time I've seen Henderson thank anyone for anything. You must have really impressed him. I just told the truth. Apparently that's impressive in these parts. It is when the truth is inconvenient. Caleb helped her into the wagon. You were right about all of this. About going after Pike. About pooling resources. I'm sorry I fought you on it. You weren't wrong to be cautious. This is risky. But necessary. You made me see that. They rode in silence for a while, the landscape rolling past in shades of white and gray. Then Caleb spoke again. The rancher, Henderson, he called you Mrs. Vance. That's my name. I know, but everyone else calls you Mrs. Mercer, because that's what you are legally, according to the marriage contract. Eliza looked at him, trying to read his expression. Does it bother you that I still use my first husband's name? No, yes. I don't know. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. It's just a reminder that this isn't a real marriage. Not in the way most people think of marriage. We never pretended it was. I know. And I'm not asking for it to be. He trailed off, struggling for words. Sometimes I forget that this is an arrangement, a practical solution to practical problems. And then something happens that reminds me, and it feels strange. Eliza didn't know what to say to that. Their arrangement had worked precisely because it wasn't complicated by expectations of romance or emotional entanglement. They were partners in survival, not lovers. That clarity had made everything easier. But lately, things had felt less clear. The way Caleb looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The way she found herself thinking about him during the long evenings when he was out checking livestock, the quiet intimacy of working together toward shared goals. It wasn't love. Neither of them was naive enough to call it that. But it was something that hadn't been there in the beginning. I could change it, she said finally. Start using Mercer instead of Vance, if that would make things less complicated. Would it? Make things less complicated? Probably not. Then don't. Keep your name, keep the boundaries clear. That's probably smarter anyway. But he didn't sound convinced, and neither was she. The next 2 weeks were consumed by the investigation. Eliza helped collect feed samples from the Mercer property, carefully documenting everything about their storage and the symptoms observed in the cattle. She wrote a detailed statement about the timeline of illness, the progression of symptoms, and her reasoning for identifying contamination versus natural disease. Other ranches contributed similar documentation. Porter left for Denver with a satchel full of samples and statements, promising to return as quickly as possible. And throughout it all, Pike remained blissfully unaware that his world was about to collapse. Or so they thought. The fire started just after midnight on a Thursday. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming. She was out of bed and down the stairs before her mind fully processed what was happening. The barn was burning. Flames climbed the walls with terrifying speed, fed by dry wood and winter hay. Animals panicked inside, their cries cutting through the night. Caleb was already outside, yelling for the boys, trying to organize a response. Eliza ran toward the barn without thinking. "Stay back," Caleb shouted when he saw her. "The horses are still inside." "I know. Thomas and I will get them. You need to—" A section of roof collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. Sparks exploded into the night sky. The horses' screams intensified. Eliza saw Thomas start toward the barn door and saw the beam fall. She moved on instinct, tackling him sideways as burning timber crashed down exactly where he'd been standing. They hit the ground hard, rolling away from the flames. "Are you insane?" Thomas gasped. "Are you? That beam would have killed you." Caleb appeared above them, his face stark with fear. "Both of you, back to the house, now." "The horses?" Thomas started. "I'll get the damn horses. Move!" Eliza pulled Thomas to his feet and pushed him toward the house where Mara stood with the younger children, all of them wide-eyed with terror. Then she turned back to the barn. Caleb had managed to get the main door open. Smoke poured out in thick black clouds. Through the haze, Eliza could see him moving inside, trying to reach the stalls where the horses were trapped. Another beam cracked overhead. Eliza grabbed a wet horse blanket someone had dropped and wrapped it around her shoulders. She heard Mara yelling at her to stop, heard Thomas trying to follow, but she was already moving. The heat inside the barn was overwhelming. Smoke made it nearly impossible to see or breathe. She dropped low, remembering something her father had taught her years ago about smoke rising, staying under it when you could. She found Caleb at the third stall, struggling with a panicked horse that refused to move. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted over the roar of flames. "Helping! Take that one. I'll get the others. Eliza?" "We don't have time to argue." She was right. They didn't. Working together, they managed to free 4 horses and drive them toward the door. The animals were terrified, but survival instinct took over once they saw open air. They bolted into the night, away from the flames. 1 horse remained, a young mare, trapped in the back stall, too frightened to move. "Leave her!" Caleb grabbed Eliza's arm. "The roof's going to collapse any second. She'll die. So will we if we don't get out now." Eliza looked at the mare, at the fear in her eyes, and made a decision that was probably stupid and definitely reckless. She yanked free from Caleb's grip and ran for the back stall. The mare reared when Eliza reached her, hooves flashing dangerously close. Eliza dodged, got a hand on the halter, and pulled with all her strength. "Come on, damn you, move!" The mare resisted, wild with panic. Behind them, Eliza heard a deep groaning sound, the kind of sound that meant structural failure was imminent. She wrapped both hands in the halter rope and pulled again, putting her whole body weight into it. "Please, please move." Maybe it was her voice. Maybe it was pure chance, but the mare suddenly lurched forward, following Eliza's pull. They ran for the door together. Caleb was there, grabbing Eliza's arm and hauling her the last few feet just as the entire back section of the barn collapsed inward. Fire exploded upward, consuming everything. They fell into the snow outside, gasping and coughing. The mare bolted past them to join the other horses in the far pasture. "You're insane," Caleb said between coughs. Completely insane. The horse is alive. You could have died, but I didn't. He looked at her then, really looked, and Eliza saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, not anger, something else, something that looked almost like terror at how close she'd come to being killed. "Don't ever do that again," he said, his voice rough. "Don't ever risk yourself like that for an animal." "You were doing the same thing." "That's different." "How?" "Because I—" He stopped himself, seeming to realize what he'd been about to say. "Just don't." The barn burned through the rest of the night. By morning, nothing remained except smoking ruins and the acrid smell of destruction. They lost all the winter hay they'd worked so hard to collect, lost the barn itself, which would cost money and time they didn't have to rebuild, lost tools, equipment, and supplies that couldn't be easily replaced. But the horses were alive, the cattle in the far pasture were untouched, and the house remained intact. It could have been so much worse. The ranch hands arrived at dawn to help with cleanup. So did Walter Gaines and 2 other ranchers from the meeting, bringing supplies and offers of assistance. "How'd it start?" Gaines asked, surveying the damage. "Don't know," Caleb said. "Could have been an ember from the stove. Could have been a lantern knocked over. Could have been deliberately set," Eliza finished quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "You think someone did this on purpose?" Gaines asked. "I think the timing is very convenient. We start investigating Pike and suddenly our barn burns down. That's not coincidence." "You got any proof?" "No, but I've got suspicions." One of the ranch hands, a young man named Cooper, cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, I might have seen something. Last night, before the fire, I was checking the fence line on the east side and I saw a rider. Thought it was strange someone being out that late, but I figured maybe it was one of the Mercer boys." "What did the rider look like?" Caleb asked sharply. "Big man? Heavy build. Didn't get a good look at his face, but—" Cooper hesitated. "The way he sat his horse, it looked like Pike." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. "That's not proof," Gaines said finally. "A rider in the dark that might have looked like Pike. That won't hold up to anything." "But it fits the pattern," Eliza insisted. "Pike knows we're building a case against him. He knows if we succeed, he loses everything, so he tries to destroy us first. Burn down the barn, kill the livestock, bankrupt the ranch, make us too desperate to keep fighting. If you're right, and that's a big if, then we're dealing with someone willing to commit arson. Maybe worse." Gaines looked worried. "That changes things." "How?" Caleb demanded. "We already knew Pike was dangerous. This just proves it. It proves we need to be more careful, watch our backs, protect our properties." Gaines gestured at the ruins. "This could have killed someone. Almost did, from what I hear about Mrs. Vance running into a burning building." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "We need to finish this quickly," Eliza said, "before Pike has time to do more damage. When does Porter get back from Denver?" "Should be any day now," Gaines said. "Soon as we have those test results, we can file formal charges. Until then, we just have to hold on." Hold on. As if that was simple. As if they hadn't just lost the barn and most of their winter supplies. As if they weren't more vulnerable now than they'd been in months. But what choice did they have? They held on. They salvaged what they could from the barn ruins. They moved the cattle to a different pasture farther from the house. They took turns standing watch at night, just in case Pike or his associates tried something else. And they waited for Porter to return from Denver with the evidence that would either save them or prove this entire fight had been for nothing. He arrived 6 days later riding hard, his face grim. "Got the results?" he'd said, dismounting in front of the Gaines ranch where everyone had gathered. "They're worse than we thought." He pulled papers from his satchel and spread them on the table. Laboratory reports, dense with technical language but clear in their conclusion. The feed samples contained multiple types of mycotoxins at levels high enough to kill livestock. The contamination was severe, widespread, and completely preventable with proper storage. "This is deliberate negligence at minimum," Porter said. "The laboratory supervisor said no reputable supplier would let grain get this contaminated by accident. It's either criminal incompetence or intentional poisoning." "Which means we have him," Gaines said, something like satisfaction in his voice. "We have actual proof." "We have proof of contamination," Eliza corrected. "We still need to prove Pike knew about it and sold the feed anyway." The supplier in Creston Falls will testify the grain was clean when Pike bought it, Caleb said. That puts the contamination on Pike's end. But can we prove he knew? Or can he claim ignorance and get away with it? It was the question none of them wanted to face. Scientific evidence proved the feed was toxic, but proving Pike's criminal intent was another matter entirely. There's one more thing, Porter said quietly. The laboratory supervisor mentioned that this type of contamination typically happens when someone mixes good grain with moldy grain to stretch supplies. It's a known scam in agricultural areas, and it leaves a specific pattern in the mycotoxin distribution. He pointed to one of the reports. See these numbers? They indicate the contamination wasn't consistent throughout the grain. Some portions were clean, some were deadly. That's not natural degradation, that's deliberate mixing. Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest. So he was cutting the feed, just like you suspected. Looks that way. Then we take this to the marshal, Caleb said. All of it. The test results, the supplier testimony, everything. Let the law handle it from here. And if the law doesn't care? Someone asked. Pike's got friends, influence. What if the marshal decides to look the other way? Then we make enough noise that he can't look away, Eliza said firmly. We take this to the territorial authorities. We contact every newspaper between here and Denver. We make sure everyone knows what Pike did and what it cost us. That'll make us targets, Gaines warned. We're already targets. Our barn is proof of that. She looked around the table at the rough collection of ranchers who'd lost so much already. Men who'd spent their lives building something meaningful in hard country, only to have it threatened by someone's greed. We can be afraid, she said quietly, or we can be angry. I know which one I'm choosing. One by one, they nodded, even the skeptical ones, even Henderson, who'd initially doubted her. They were done being victims. It was time to fight back. The territorial marshal arrived in Blackthorn Ridge on a cold February morning, and his presence changed the entire atmosphere of the town within hours. His name was Clayton Morris, and he looked exactly like what a frontier lawman should look like. Tall, weathered, with eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for being absolutely incorruptible. He'd been enforcing territorial law for 15 years, and everyone knew that when Morris showed up, someone was going to face consequences. Eliza watched from the general store window as he rode down the main street, flanked by 2 deputies. She'd been picking up supplies when word spread that the marshal had arrived, and now half the town had gathered to watch. Margaret Whitmore stood on the boardwalk outside her husband's old mercantile, her face tight with displeasure. Pike was nowhere to be seen, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about his guilty conscience. Mrs. Vance? Eliza turned to find Marshal Morris standing behind her, his hat in his hands. Marshal, that was quick. Got the complaint from Gaines 2 days ago. Figured this was serious enough to handle personally. He gestured toward the door. Mind if we talk outside? Prefer not to have an audience for this conversation. They stepped out onto the boardwalk. Morris studied her with the kind of careful attention that made Eliza feel like he was cataloging every detail. You're the one who identified the contamination pattern, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. The report says you recognized mycotoxin poisoning based on symptom observation. That's not common knowledge for most frontier women. My father worked in mining camps. I learned to pay attention to what killed livestock because it usually meant something was wrong with the water or feed supply. Miners depended on that knowledge. Morris nodded slowly. The laboratory results are conclusive. The feed was contaminated. Question is whether Pike knew about it or if he's just criminally negligent. He knew, Eliza said flatly. The contamination pattern proves he was mixing good grain with bad to stretch his profits. That's not an accident. Proving what he knew and proving what he did are 2 different things in a court of law. Then what are you doing here if you can't prove anything? Morris's expression didn't change, but Eliza caught a hint of approval in his eyes. I'm here to investigate, gather testimony, examine evidence, and if I find sufficient cause, I'll arrest Pike and transport him to the territorial capital for trial. And if you don't find sufficient cause, then Pike walks free and everyone goes back to their lives. But between you and me, ma'am, I've read the reports, I've seen the laboratory results, and I've dealt with enough criminals to recognize a pattern when I see one. Pike's got guilty written all over him. So you believe us? I believe the evidence. What I need now is witnesses willing to testify under oath about what happened, starting with you. Eliza spent the next 3 hours giving her statement to Marshal Morris. She detailed everything from the moment she first noticed the sick cattle to her confrontation with Pike in the saloon. She described the symptoms, the timeline, the pattern of contamination. She held nothing back. Morris took notes in a small leather journal, asking pointed questions that proved he understood exactly what he was dealing with. "You realize Pike's going to claim this is all a vendetta," he said when they finished. "That you're a disgruntled woman trying to cause trouble because the town didn't accept you. Let him claim whatever he wants. The evidence speaks for itself." Evidence can be interpreted different ways by different people. A good lawyer could argue that Pike was simply careless, not criminal, that he didn't intend to harm anyone. "A good lawyer could argue the sky is green if you paid him enough," Eliza said sharply. "That doesn't make it true." Morris actually smiled at that. "No, ma'am, it doesn't." Over the next 2 days, Morris interviewed every rancher who'd suffered losses. He examined the remaining feed samples. He talked to Pike's supplier in Creston Falls, who confirmed that the grain sold to Pike had been clean and properly stored. And slowly, methodically, he built a case that even Pike's friends couldn't dismiss. The arrest happened on the 3rd day. Morris found Pike at the saloon, surrounded by supporters who'd been feeding him false confidence about his invulnerability. The marshal walked in with both deputies, read the charges in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, and placed Pike under arrest for criminal negligence and fraud. Pike's face went from confident to furious to genuinely frightened in the space of seconds. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "I have rights. I have friends. You can't just—" "I can and I am," Morris said calmly. "You have the right to legal representation. You have the right to a fair trial. What you don't have is the right to poison livestock and destroy people's livelihoods for profit. This is because of her." Pike pointed at Eliza, who'd followed Morris into the saloon along with Caleb and several other ranchers. "That Eastern woman who doesn't know her place. She's been causing trouble since she arrived." "Mrs. Vance identified a crime," Morris corrected. "She didn't commit one. There's a difference. She's turned this whole town upside down, turned families against each other, made people question things that worked fine before she showed up." Eliza stepped forward before Caleb could stop her. "Things weren't working fine. They were working for you. There's a difference." Pike lunged toward her, but the deputies grabbed him before he got close. "You self-righteous? That's enough," Morris said sharply. "You're making this worse for yourself. I suggest you stop talking until you have a lawyer present." They led Pike out in handcuffs while half the town watched in stunned silence. Margaret Whitmore stood on the boardwalk, her face pale with shock. For the first time since Eliza had arrived in Blackthorn Ridge, the woman looked genuinely uncertain. "This isn't over," she said as Morris passed. "Pike has friends, influential people. They won't let this stand." "Then those influential people can explain to a judge why they're protecting a criminal," Morris replied evenly. "Should make for an interesting trial." After Pike's arrest, something fundamental shifted in Blackthorn Ridge. The ranchers who'd suffered losses felt vindicated. The families who'd been sympathetic to Eliza from the start became more vocal in their support. And even some of Margaret Whitmore's circle began questioning whether they'd backed the wrong person. But vindication didn't rebuild the Mercer barn. 2 weeks after Pike's arrest, Eliza stood in the charred ruins trying to calculate what rebuilding would cost. The numbers were brutal. Even with the compensation they might eventually receive if Pike was convicted and ordered to pay damages, they were looking at months of work and resources they barely had. "We could put up a temporary structure," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her. "Just enough to get through spring, then rebuild properly when we have more money." "That's throwing good money after bad. We build it once, we build it right." "With what funds, Eliza?" "We're already operating on nothing. The cattle losses, the feed replacement, now this. I don't know how much longer we can keep going." Eliza heard the exhaustion in his voice, saw it in the slump of his shoulders. Caleb had been carrying this ranch and this family for so long, and the weight was finally breaking him. "Then we ask for help," she said quietly. "We've asked for enough. Not from the town, from the ranchers, the ones who benefited from us exposing Pike. They owe us." Caleb looked at her. "You want to call in favors?" "I want to remind people that sometimes survival requires community, that we help each other because someday we might need help ourselves. That's not charity, that's just how life should work. And if they say no, then we figure out something else. But we don't give up. We never give up. The barn raising happened on a Saturday in late March. Eliza woke that morning to find wagons rolling into the ranch yard. Walter Gaines arrived first with his sons and a load of lumber. Then Henderson with a crew of ranch hands. Then Porter and 3 other ranchers from the investigation. Even families Eliza barely knew showed up with tools and food and willing hands. By mid-morning, there were 40 people working on the new barn. Men cutting lumber and hammering frames, women cooking massive amounts of food to feed everyone, children running underfoot, getting in the way but also helping in small ways. It was the kind of community effort that Eliza had thought only existed in stories. Margaret Whitmore did not attend. Neither did her closest supporters. But their absence felt less important somehow, less powerful than the presence of everyone who did show up. Mara worked alongside Eliza, helping coordinate the food preparation and supplies. At one point, the girls stopped and just looked at the scene in front of them. "I never thought I'd see this," she said quietly. "Everyone working together like this. For us." "It's not just for us," Eliza replied. "It's for the principle, people helping people. That's bigger than any individual family. Still, after everything that happened, the way the town treated you, I didn't think they'd ever change their minds. Some of them haven't, but enough of them have, and that's what matters." By sunset, the barn frame was up. Not finished, but close enough that the remaining work could be completed by the Mercer family over the following weeks. The crowd dispersed slowly, tired but satisfied with what they'd accomplished. Walter Gaines was the last to leave. He found Eliza cleaning up the food preparation area and pulled her aside. "There's talk in town," he said without preamble. "About you. About what you did." "What kind of talk?" "The good kind. People saying you showed courage when everyone else was too afraid to act, that you identified a problem and refused to let it slide just because it was inconvenient or unpopular." Eliza dried her hands on her apron. "I just did what needed doing. That's what makes it meaningful. You didn't do it for glory or recognition. You did it because it was right." He paused. "There's going to be changes in this town. The marshal's investigation uncovered other problems with Pike's business dealings. Turns out the contaminated feed was just the beginning. He'd been running scams for years, and people are starting to realize how much damage he did." "What happens to him now?" "Trial's set for next month in the territorial capital. With the evidence Morris collected, Pike's looking at serious prison time and financial restitution to everyone he defrauded." "Will that be enough to make people whole again?" Gaines shrugged. "Money doesn't bring back dead cattle or lost time, but it's something, and it's more than we'd have gotten if you hadn't pushed for the investigation." After he left, Eliza stood in the yard watching the sun set behind the mountains. The new barn frame stood dark against the sky, a monument to what people could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conflict. She felt someone come up beside her and knew without looking that it was Caleb. "Hell of a day," he said. "Yes. I underestimated you when you first arrived. I thought you were just another woman answering a desperate advertisement because you had no better options." "I was that woman." "No, you were more than that. I just couldn't see it yet." Eliza turned to look at him. In the fading light, his face looked younger somehow, less burdened, like maybe he was finally starting to believe they might actually survive this. "What are you trying to say, Caleb?" "I'm trying to say thank you for coming here, for staying when things got hard, for fighting battles I was too tired to fight, for saving my children and my ranch and probably my sanity." He paused. "And I'm trying to say that this arrangement we have, this practical partnership, it's become something more, at least for me." Eliza's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Caleb, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to change anything about how we do things. I just wanted you to know that when I look at you now, I don't see a stranger or a hired hand or a mail-order bride. I see my partner, my equal, someone I trust more than anyone else in this world." That's a lot of weight to put on a person. "I know. And if it's too much, you can tell me to shut up and we'll never talk about it again. But I needed to say it, just once." Eliza looked at this hard, honest man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, who'd let her prove herself on her own terms, who'd stood beside her through every fight and never once asked her to be anything other than who she was. "It's not too much," she said quietly, "and I don't want you to shut up." "No? No." She reached out and took his hand, rough and calloused from years of ranch work. I came here thinking this was just survival, a roof over my head and work to fill my days. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. This ranch, this family, you, it all became more. Is that a good thing? I don't know yet. Ask me again in a year. Caleb smiled then, really smiled, and Eliza realized she'd never seen him look quite so unguarded. Fair enough, he said. They stood together watching night fall over the ranch. Two people who'd each lost everything once and were slowly building something new from the ruins. Pike's trial lasted 3 days. Eliza didn't attend, couldn't afford the time or travel costs. But Gaines went as a representative for the affected ranchers, and he returned with news that spread through Blackthorn Ridge like wildfire. Pike had been found guilty on multiple charges: criminal negligence, fraud, endangerment. The list went on. He was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison and ordered to pay restitution to everyone he'd defrauded. The restitution wouldn't be much. Pike's assets were limited once his debts were settled, but it was something. A recognition that what he'd done was wrong and that consequences existed even for well-connected men. Margaret Whitmore's social power evaporated almost overnight. With Pike gone and her judgment proven catastrophically wrong, people stopped seeking her approval. The younger families who'd been quietly sympathetic to Eliza became openly friendly. Invitations started arriving at the Mercer Ranch for social gatherings and community events. Eliza accepted some and politely declined others. She didn't need the town's approval anymore. But she wasn't going to hold grudges either. Life was too short and too hard for unnecessary bitterness. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, like it always did in mountain country. Ice melted, grass pushed through snow. The cattle that survived winter began gaining weight on fresh pasture, and the Mercer Ranch, which had come so close to complete collapse, began to feel stable again. The new barn was finished by mid-April. Not fancy, but solid, built to last. Eliza stood in the doorway one morning, breathing in the smell of fresh wood and new hay, and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite contentment, more like the absence of constant fear. "You look thoughtful," Mara said, coming up beside her with Annie and Samuel in tow. "Just thinking about how far we've come since last fall." "You mean since you arrived and turned everything upside down?" "Was that what I did?" Mara smiled. "That's exactly what you did. And it's the best thing that could have happened to this family." Annie tugged on Eliza's skirt. "Are you staying forever?" "What?" "Mara said you might leave someday, that you only came because Pa needed help. But you're not leaving, are you? Because you're my favorite and I don't want you to go." Eliza knelt down to Annie's level. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart." "Promise?" "I promise." "Good." Annie threw her arms around Eliza's neck. "Because you're part of the family now. Mara said so, and Samuel said so. And even Thomas said so, even though he pretends he doesn't care about mushy stuff." Over Annie's head, Eliza met Mara's eyes. The girl was crying, trying to hide it, but crying nonetheless. "Thank you," Mara said quietly. "For everything, for staying, for fighting, for showing me that being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. Because you saved us. Not just the ranch or the cattle, us, the family. You saved us from destroying ourselves." That evening, the whole family gathered around the dinner table. It had become a ritual, this nightly meal together. A time when work stopped and they were just people sharing food and conversation. Thomas was talking about plans for spring planting. Ben was arguing with Daniel about something neither of them would remember tomorrow. Annie was chattering at Samuel about a bird she'd seen. Mara was helping serve food while stealing glances at a ranch hand who'd started coming around more often. And Caleb sat at the head of the table, watching his children with an expression that looked like peace. Eliza served the last plate and sat down in her usual chair. Annie immediately climbed into her lap, claiming her territory like always. "Mrs. Vance," Thomas said suddenly. "Ma'am, I've been meaning to ask, why did you really come here? I mean, I know Pa sent a letter and you answered it, but you could have gone anywhere. Why this place?" The table went quiet, everyone waiting for her answer. Eliza thought about how to explain it, about losing everything, about the desperate need for purpose, about answering an advertisement from a stranger because anything was better than the slow death of living on charity from people who resented your existence. But that wasn't the whole truth. I came here because I needed somewhere to go, she said finally. Because your father offered me a chance when no one else would. But I stayed because I found something worth fighting for. This ranch, this family. The idea that people could build something meaningful in hard places if they were willing to work for it. That's it? Daniel asked. You stayed just because of work? Work is important. It gives you purpose, direction, a reason to get up every morning. Eliza looked around the table at 6 children who'd gone from hostile strangers to something like family. But no, that's not all of it. I stayed because you needed me, and because I needed you. Because family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to show up for each other day after day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, Mara added quietly. Especially then. Little Samuel, who rarely spoke, suddenly announced, I'm glad you came. Me too, baby. Are you going to marry Pa for real now? Not just the paper kind? The question landed like a stone in still water. Caleb choked on his coffee. Mara looked fascinated. The older boys suddenly found their plates very interesting. Samuel, Caleb said weakly, we don't. Why not? Samuel persisted with the logic of a child who hadn't learned that some questions were complicated. You like her. She likes you. You already live together and do family stuff. That's what married people do, right? It's more complicated than that, Eliza said carefully. Why? Because she looked at Caleb, who looked back at her with an expression that said he was no help whatsoever. Because your father and I have an arrangement, a partnership. We work together to keep this ranch running and take care of all of you. That's different from a traditional marriage. But you could make it a traditional marriage if you wanted to, Thomas pointed out. Right? Theoretically, yes. So why don't you want to? Eliza realized she'd been backed into a corner by children who were far more perceptive than she'd given them credit for. I didn't say I didn't want to, she said slowly. I said it's complicated. Everything's complicated if you think about it too much, Mara observed. Sometimes you just have to decide what you want and go after it. When did you become so wise? I learned from watching you. Caleb finally found his voice. Kids, I think this is a conversation Mrs. Vance and I need to have privately, without an audience. But we want to know, Daniel started. Later, after dinner. Now finish eating before it gets cold. The meal continued with slightly less tension but significantly more meaningful glances. When it ended and the children scattered to their evening chores, Caleb and Eliza found themselves alone in the kitchen again. Well, Caleb said, that was subtle. Your children are not known for their subtlety. No, they get that from me. He came around the table to stand beside her. But they're not wrong about us, about what this has become. What has it become? More than a business arrangement, more than a marriage of convenience, something real, something worth keeping. Eliza turned to face him fully. Are you asking me to make this official? To actually be your wife instead of just someone who lives here and helps manage things? I'm asking if you'd want that, if it would make you happy, because somewhere along the way, your happiness started mattering to me as much as the ranch's survival. That's dangerous. I know. We could ruin what we have, make it complicated and messy. We could. Or we could make it better, stronger, the kind of partnership that goes beyond survival into actually building a life together. Eliza thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago. Broken, grieving, desperate. That woman had needed safety and purpose and work to fill her days. But the woman she was now needed more than that. She needed this complicated, difficult man who'd given her space to be herself. These children who'd accepted her despite every reason not to. This hard place that had tested her and found her worthy. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I want that. The real thing. Not just the arrangement, the actual marriage. The partnership that goes beyond survival. Caleb's face did something complicated. Relief and joy and fear all mixed together. You're sure? I'm terrified, but yes, I'm sure. He kissed her then, and it wasn't romantic or perfect, or anything like the stories made it seem. It was awkward and uncertain and tasted like coffee. It was absolutely right. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. The children are going to be insufferable about this, Caleb said. Completely insufferable. Worth it, though. Definitely worth it. The wedding happened quietly 2 weeks later. Just the family, Walter Gaines as witness, and a traveling minister who happened to be passing through the territory. Eliza wore a simple dress Mara had helped her make. Caleb wore his best shirt. The children stood as witnesses, all of them beaming like they'd personally arranged the entire thing. When the minister asked if they took each other as husband and wife, Eliza thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The losses and fights and desperate struggles, the slow building of trust, the partnership that had become something more. "I do," she said. "I do," Caleb echoed. And just like that, the arrangement became something real. The reception was held in the new barn. Not fancy, but the food was good and the company was better. People from town actually attended, including some who'd been part of Margaret Whitmore's circle. Henderson gave a toast about stubborn women who changed things for the better. Gaines told embarrassing stories about Caleb's early ranching failures. It was exactly the kind of celebration Eliza never knew she wanted. Late in the evening, she found herself standing outside the barn, looking at the stars. The same stars she'd looked at her first night in Blackthorn Ridge, when everything seemed impossible and she'd almost left on the next train. Mara came to stand beside her. "Tired?" the girl asked. "Exhausted?" "Happy, but exhausted." "Good exhausted or bad exhausted?" "The best kind. The kind that comes from doing something meaningful." Mara was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you stayed. I know I gave you hell at first, made things as difficult as possible, but I'm glad you stayed anyway. So am I. You know what the best part is?" "What?" "Watching you prove everyone wrong. Everyone who said you were too weak, too soft, too Eastern for frontier life. You proved them all wrong just by refusing to quit." Eliza smiled. "That's not the best part." "Then what is?" "The best part is learning that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being brave enough to accept it. That survival isn't a solo act. It's something we do together." "That's very profound. I'm feeling profound tonight. It's been that kind of day." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Inside the barn, someone had started playing a fiddle. The sound of laughter and music drifted out into the night. "You changed us," Mara said suddenly. "This whole family. We were falling apart before you arrived, drowning in grief and exhaustion and the weight of trying to survive alone. And you showed up and just made it possible to hope again. I think we changed each other. Maybe. But I needed to say thank you for not giving up on us. On me. Even when I made it very clear I didn't want you here. You were protecting your family. That's not something to apologize for. Still, thank you." Inside the barn, Caleb appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light. He caught sight of Eliza and smiled, and something in her chest loosened. This was home now. Not the place she'd expected, not the life she'd imagined, but home nonetheless, built from hard work and harder choices. From refusing to quit when quitting seemed like the only rational option. From choosing partnership over isolation, community over resentment, hope over despair. She'd come to Blackthorn Ridge with nothing but a carpet bag and a marriage contract she'd almost thrown away. Now she had a family, a ranch, a purpose. A man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a burden to manage. She had survived, and more than survived. She had built something worth keeping. That night, after the celebration ended and the guests departed, Eliza stood in the bedroom she now truly shared with Caleb and looked at herself in the small mirror. The woman staring back was different from the one who'd arrived 6 months ago. Harder, yes. More weathered, lines around her eyes from squinting into sun and wind, hands calloused from work, but also stronger, more certain, more herself. "You all right?" Caleb asked from behind her. "Just thinking." "About?" "About how strange life is. How you can lose everything and think that's the end, that you'll never build anything meaningful again. And then you find yourself somewhere unexpected doing work you never imagined, and somehow it becomes exactly what you needed." "Is that what this is? What you needed?" "Yes. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts maybe, because they taught me that I was stronger than I thought, that I could survive things I was sure would destroy me." Caleb crossed the room and put his hands on her shoulders, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "You know what I learned?" he asked. "What?" that asking for help isn't weakness, that letting someone in doesn't mean losing yourself, that partnership can be more powerful than stubbornness. He paused. You taught me that, by showing up every day and refusing to let me push you away. I'm good at refusing to be pushed away. You're good at a lot of things, but that's definitely one of them. They stood together for a moment, two people who'd found each other through desperation and built something real through determination. Outside, the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, cattle shifting in their pens, wind through the new barn, the distant sound of an owl calling. All the sounds of life continuing, of survival earned through hard work and harder choices. Eliza had come to Blackthorn Ridge expecting nothing more than a place to exist, a roof over her head and work to fill her days. Instead, she'd found a reason to keep fighting, a family to fight for, and the understanding that strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about having the courage to put yourself back together afterward. She'd broken when her first husband died, shattered into pieces that took months to gather. But here, in this hard place with this complicated family, she'd learned to be whole again. Not the same as before. Better, maybe. Definitely stronger. And still fighting, still showing up, still refusing to quit, because that's what people like her did, what people like all of them did. They survived the impossible, built something from nothing, turned arrangements into family and strangers into partners. They showed up every morning and did the next necessary thing, even when everything screamed to stop. They made bread when they wanted to cry, mended fences when their hands wouldn't stop shaking, set tables properly because small acts of care mattered, even when nobody seemed to notice. And slowly, one day at a time, they built lives worth living. That was the real victory. Not defeating enemies or winning social acceptance or even saving the ranch, though all those things mattered. The real victory was learning that you could lose everything and still find a way to build something new. That endings weren't final if you had the courage to start again. That family was something you chose as much as something you were born into. Eliza had chosen this family, this ranch, this hard, unforgiving place, and they had chosen her back. That made all the difference. Years later, when travelers passed through Blackthorn Ridge, they would hear stories about the Mercer Ranch, about the widow who arrived with nothing and helped save an entire valley from a criminal's greed, about the woman who ran into a burning barn to save horses and stood up to corrupt men when no one else would. But those weren't the stories Eliza cared about. The stories that mattered were smaller, more personal. Annie learning to read, curled up in Eliza's lap by lamplight. Mara teaching her own daughters the recipes Eliza had taught her. Thomas taking over the ranch management and running it with the same careful attention to detail he'd learned watching Eliza reorganize the pantry that first week. Caleb, years older, sitting on the porch in the evening and still reaching for Eliza's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Those were the victories that mattered, the quiet ones. The ones built day by day through showing up and doing the work, and refusing to quit. And on cold winter nights, when Eliza sat by the fire watching her family move through their evening routines, she would remember that terrified woman who stepped off a train into an uncertain future. She would remember almost turning back a dozen times. And she would be grateful she hadn't. Because this life, with all its hardships and complications and unexpected joys, was exactly what she'd needed. Not the life she'd planned, the life she'd earned, and that made it worth everything.